Tonight, we're going somewhere the rest of the world still struggles to believe is real. A vast, dry, sun-blasted continent sitting alone at the bottom of the earth, where the spiders are the size of your palm, the trees have been known to explode, and the national history reads less like a record of facts and more like something scribbled down after a very long night at the pub. Welcome to Australia, a country whose true, documented, thoroughly footnoted history is stranger than most people's fiction. Before we drift off together, if you're enjoying this kind of slow, strange, true storytelling, consider subscribing, only if it's genuinely something you look forward to. A quiet thank you as well to the viewer who first requested this topic. This channel exists because of requests like that, and it never stops meaning something. Drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are. It's always lovely to picture this story reaching so many different clocks and time zones at once. The show is also available now on Spotify, for anyone who prefers to simply close their eyes and listen. And if you'd like even more of this to fall asleep to, channel membership now unlocks extended, ad-free versions for uninterrupted overnight listening. Now, dim the lights. Let the room go quiet, and let's step gently into tonight's journey. Before we begin properly, sit with a few questions for a moment. Is it true that a modern army, fully armed with machine guns, once tried to fight a war against birds and lost? Did a country really choose its own capital city by refusing to let two rival cities have it, and building a brand new one from nothing instead, essentially out of spite? Is there truly an animal walking around the outback right now producing droppings shaped like perfect little cubes? Did a serious scientist once take a pair of scissors to a dead animal, convinced it was a hoax stitched together as a prank? And is it true that a nation, faced with one imported pest problem, solved it by importing a second pest, which then became a bigger problem than the first? The answer, every time, is yes. Welcome to Australia, a place where the make-believe stories tend to be true and the true stories tend to sound completely made up. Watch your footing. Mind the spiders. And whatever you do, try not to declare war on anything with feathers. Let's begin in 1932 in the wheat country of Western Australia, where the Australian military found itself, quite officially, at war. Not with a rival nation. Not with any human enemy at all. Their opponent was the emu, a tall, flightless, faintly ridiculous-looking bird that had, in tens of thousands, wandered in from the outback to help itself to the region's wheat harvest. The farmers who owned that wheat were furious, and more than a few of them were former soldiers, freshly home from the First World War, who understood exactly what they thought the solution should be. Bring in the army. Remarkably, the government agreed. Soldiers were dispatched. Machine guns were loaded. Thousands of rounds of ammunition were packed and shipped out to the bush, all aimed, quite seriously, at eliminating a bird problem through military firepower. It must have looked on paper like the most one-sided contest imaginable. Trained soldiers, modern automatic weapons, against an animal best known for standing in fields looking unbothered. Nobody thought to inform the emus that they were supposed to lose. The man given command of this peculiar operation was a major of artillery, sent out with a small detachment, a pair of machine guns, and enough ammunition to make any accountant nervous. The emus, when the shooting actually started, did not behave like a defeated enemy is supposed to. They scattered. They split into small, fast-moving groups. They zigzagged across open ground with what almost looked like tactical awareness. And the guns, expensive, modern, military-grade guns, jammed at exactly the wrong moments, again and again. It got stranger still. Witnesses reported that the emu groups seemed to organize themselves almost like military units of their own, with one bird appearing to stand as a lookout while the rest fed, ready to sound the alarm the moment anything resembling a soldier came into view. Ambushes set up near watering holes collapsed into chaos as the birds absorbed hits that would have ended most confrontations and simply kept running, kept feeding, kept refusing to die on schedule. The commanding officer, by the end of it, is said to have remarked, with a kind of grim, reluctant respect, that if his own men could take punishment the way these birds did, they'd be unstoppable against any army on the planet. That is not a sentence a military commander expects to say about poultry. If you've ever tried to catch a greased pig at a fair, corral a toddler through a crowded store, or wrangle a stubborn shopping cart with one wheel that refuses to cooperate, you have some small taste of what those soldiers went through, magnified 100-fold and conducted under a punishing outback sun. The operation was eventually called off. It was mocked mercilessly in the newspapers. A second attempt was launched later after more farmer complaints, and that, too, fizzled out. Questions were even raised back in Parliament about how so much ammunition had been spent for so little result, a ratio no military budget would ever want printed in a report. And here is the detail that makes the whole affair so wonderfully, stubbornly Australian. The emus never surrendered because there was never any surrender to be had. No treaty was signed. No flag was lowered. They simply outran, outlasted, and thoroughly outstubborned a modern nation's army, then went back to eating the wheat as if nothing at all had happened. Better fencing and a bounty system eventually did what the machine guns could not. But the legend of that campaign was already written in stone, or rather, in an official military record that genuinely documents a war fought against birds, machine guns and all, that the birds comprehensively won. Now let's talk about an animal that, when it first reached European hands, was treated not with scientific wonder, but with outright suspicion. Near the close of the 1700s, a preserved specimen arrived in Britain from the far side of the world. A strange little creature with the flattened bill of a duck, the tail of a beaver, webbed feet like an otter, and a body wrapped in thick fur. Stranger still, word arrived that this animal laid eggs like a reptile, yet nursed its young with something like milk, the way mammals do. To the tidy, rule-bound scientific minds of the era, this did not look like a newly discovered animal. It looked like a joke, a fraud stitched together by some clever prankster hoping to fool gullible Europeans. According to the accounts of the time, one scientist actually took a pair of scissors to the specimen, searching along its seams for stitches that would expose the trick. There were no stitches to find. But you can understand, in fairness, why the suspicion arose. European science at the time had spent generations sorting the natural world into clean, orderly categories. Furred animals gave birth to live young. Egg layers were birds or reptiles. The system was neat, logical, and comforting, right up until a soggy package turned up from the far side of the planet containing something that seemed to have ignored every rule on purpose. Picture ordering a simple sedan and receiving instead something that was somehow part car, part boat, part garden tool, insisting all the while that this was perfectly ordinary where it came from. The scientific establishment of the day had good reason to be wary of hoaxes. Traders and sailors of the period were known for stitching together fake mermaids out of monkey torsos and fish tails to sell to the curious and the credulous. So the working theory was not that nature had gotten unusually creative on a remote continent, but that some enterprising con artist somewhere near the far side of the globe had glued a duck's face onto a small mammal and shipped the result off as a prank. Hence the scissors. Hence the search for seams that were never actually there. Then slowly, reluctantly, the truth began to surface, and it turned out to be even stranger than the fraud everyone had suspected. That bill really was real, and it turned out to be an extraordinarily sensitive organ, packed with receptors that let the animal hunt underwater with its eyes fully closed, detecting the faint electrical signals given off by its prey like a built-in, furry metal detector. The males really did carry a venomous spur on their hind legs, capable of delivering pain so severe that people who have experienced it describe agony that ordinary painkillers barely touch. And the egg-laying, the detail that had seemed most absurd of all, was finally confirmed decades later, a discovery that sent genuine excitement rippling through the scientific community of the time. So the platypus went from suspected forgery to one of the most quietly bizarre animals alive on Earth. It is a creature that behaves as though several different design committees worked on it separately and never once compared notes. It glows faintly under ultraviolet light, for reasons researchers are still working out. It lacks a conventional stomach. It produces something closer to a sweat than actual milk to feed its young. Every time science thinks it has finally finished cataloging the platypus's strangeness, the animal produces one more surprise, like a performer who simply refuses to leave the stage. The gentle lesson tucked inside all of this. Sometimes the thing that sounds far too ridiculous to be real turns out to be exactly that, real, and sitting quietly in a river in Australia, being wonderfully improbable, with absolutely no concern for how it looks on paper. Let's turn now to the earliest years of the colony of New South Wales, when the fledgling settlement found itself with almost no proper coin currency at all. In its place, the settlers landed on a currency everybody could agree had genuine value: rum. Wages were paid in it. Debts were settled with it. An entire informal economy sloshed forward on the strength of imported spirits arriving by ship. And the military officers who controlled the flow of that rum grew steadily richer and steadily more powerful, powerful enough that, when a new governor arrived determined to break their grip on the trade, they simply removed him from office by force. In 1808, those officers marched on Government House and staged what remains, to this day, the only successful armed takeover of government in the country's history. The root cause of the entire coup was, in the plainest possible terms, alcohol. To understand how a colony ends up quite literally drinking its own payroll, picture the situation clearly. This was a settlement founded largely as a remote penal outpost, sitting on the far edge of the known world, chronically short of supplies, and almost entirely without official coinage. When reliable coins don't exist, people improvise with whatever holds steady value, and what this colony had no shortage of was strong spirits arriving regularly by sea. Rum was compact, always desired, and unlikely to lose its appeal overnight, which made it a surprisingly dependable store of value. A man might be paid a day's wages in a measure of spirits, then trade that same measure for tools, food, or someone else's labor. The entire settlement was, in a very real sense, running on liquor. Naturally, whoever controlled that supply controlled the colony, and that turned out to be the officers of the local military corps. They imported it, they distributed it, and they grew wealthy and influential on the back of the trade, to the point where people began referring to them, unofficially, as the corps that ran on rum. Into this cozy, deeply entrenched arrangement stepped a new governor determined to break the monopoly and reign in the colony's most powerful trader, a famously stubborn, difficult man who had already lived through one legendary rebellion, having been the captain of a ship whose own crew had mutinied against him and set him adrift years earlier. Fate, it seems, enjoys a cruel repeat performance. His crackdown on the rum trade made him powerful enemies quickly. Tensions rose, tempers frayed. And on a summer evening, the officers had simply had enough. Soldiers marched on Government House with bayonets fixed and a drummer keeping time, and the governor's authority collapsed within a single afternoon. Popular legend, gleefully repeated ever since, claims he was found hiding under a bed, a detail he furiously denied for the rest of his life. Whether or not that particular detail is true, the outcome was the same either way. The head of the colony had been overthrown by his own military, over control of liquor. The rebels ran the colony themselves for a time before order was eventually restored from London, and the ringleaders were called to account, though the punishments handed down were remarkably gentle for men who had just staged an armed coup. The rum trade was gradually brought under control. Proper currency eventually arrived. And the colony grew into something that no longer paid its tradesmen in spirits. But the story never loses its edge of absurdity. A settlement so short on cash that it ran on liquor, guarded by soldiers so invested in that liquor that they toppled their own governor to protect it, and at the center of it all, a man who had survived one legendary mutiny at sea, only to be overthrown by a second one on dry land, this time not over food and cruelty, but over the price of a drink. Now, to one of the most infamous cautionary tales in the entire story of introduced species anywhere on Earth. In 1935, someone in Queensland had what felt, at the time, like a genuinely brilliant idea. The colony's enormously valuable sugarcane crop was being devastated by a particular species of beetle, and word had spread that a certain large, warty toad from Central and South America had a voracious appetite for exactly that kind of beetle. So a small breeding population of cane toads, somewhere in the range of 100 animals, was shipped over from Hawaii, where they had already been introduced for similar reasons, and released into a holding pond in Queensland to multiply before being sent out to patrol the cane fields. The plan looked almost elegant, at least on paper. A destructive beetle was threatening a valuable crop, and here was a hungry amphibian with a well-earned reputation for eating beetles in vast quantities. The scientist behind the scheme was reportedly quite optimistic about the whole affair. Nature, as it so often does in these stories, had other plans entirely, and nature rarely bothers to read anyone's optimistic memo before acting. The fatal flaw revealed itself almost immediately, and it was embarrassingly simple. The particular beetles causing all the damage spent the bulk of their lives either high up on the cane stalks, well out of reach, or buried down in the soil, equally out of reach in the opposite direction. Neither location was remotely convenient for a squat, ground-dwelling toad with no real talent for climbing, and even less for digging. The toads, presented with the very pest they were imported to control, simply could not physically get to it. What the toads could do, and did with tremendous enthusiasm, was eat almost everything else within reach, breed at an astonishing rate, and survive in conditions that would have flattened a more delicate animal. A single female cane toad is capable of laying many thousands of eggs in one sitting, and the resulting young mature quickly, which meant the population did not simply grow, it detonated. Making matters dramatically worse, the toads arrived fully equipped with a defense mechanism that none of Australia's native predators had ever encountered before. Glands across their skin secrete a potent toxin, strong enough to kill a curious dog, a snake, a goanna, or a native quoll unlucky enough to try eating one. So as the toads marched steadily outward from the original cane fields, they left behind a quiet trail of poison predators, gradually hollowing out the very ecosystems that might otherwise have kept their numbers in check. And march they did. What began as a hopeful, localized experiment near a handful of sugarcane fields turned, over the following decades, into an unstoppable continental advance, hopping their way through state after state, colonizing rivers, gardens, roadsides, dams, and backyards along the way. They are still spreading today, pushing further with every wet season, entirely indifferent to the enormous effort communities have poured into slowing them down. Volunteer groups have organized toad collecting nights. Researchers have engineered elaborate trap systems. These efforts help in isolated pockets, but the sheer scale of the invasion makes any notion of total control feel like pure fantasy. The cruelest irony of the entire episode is that the original beetle problem the toads were meant to solve was, in the end, brought under control through completely different means: better farming techniques and modern pest management, developed and applied without any help from the toads at all. In other words, the toads were never actually necessary. They failed spectacularly at their one assigned job on day one, and then simply stayed on for the rest of the century as uninvited, mildly toxic houseguests who eat everything in the pantry and absolutely cannot be evicted. It stands today as a near-perfect textbook example of a cure that quietly became the disease. A country worried about a beetle problem imported a toad to solve it, and in doing so, traded a manageable agricultural nuisance for a slow-motion ecological catastrophe with warts on it. Somewhere, presumably, the beetles are having a good laugh. It began, as so many of these disasters do, with one man simply wanting a small taste of something familiar from home. In 1859, a settler named Thomas Austin released roughly 24 rabbits onto his rural property, purely so he could enjoy a spot of recreational hunting the way he remembered doing back in England. Rabbits, as it turns out, are extraordinarily good at being rabbits. Within just a few decades, those original 24 animals had exploded into a population numbering in the hundreds of millions, stripping vast stretches of land bare and turning what had once been productive farmland into dust. The crisis eventually grew so severe that authorities constructed a rabbit-proof fence running for well over 1,000 miles across Western Australia. A heroic, sprawling wall of wire built to hold back an unstoppable tide of small, twitching, endlessly hungry noses. Austin's original reasoning had seemed harmless enough at the time. He simply missed the sport of rabbit shooting from his home country, so he arranged to have some shipped out and released, reportedly remarking that a few rabbits could hardly do much harm and might add a comforting touch of home to his new property. In hindsight, this may rank among the most spectacularly wrong predictions ever casually spoken aloud by anyone, anywhere. The Australian landscape, as the rabbits quickly discovered, offered mild winters, wide-open grazing land, and a near-total absence of the predators and diseases that had kept their numbers in check back in Europe. To a rabbit, this was not simply a new continent. It was an all-you-can-eat resort with free lodging, unlimited amenities, and absolutely no house rules. The old phrase, breeding like rabbits, exists for very good reason, and here it played out on a genuinely national scale. The animals spread outward across the continent at a pace that still holds the record today as the fastest documented mammal invasion anywhere on Earth. They devoured crops down to the roots, chewed pastures into bare dirt, competed directly with livestock for grazing, and pushed native animals out of their own burrows and food sources. Entire regions that had previously supported healthy farming were reduced to scarred, overgrazed wasteland. What had started as one man's small, nostalgic hobby had metastasized into an environmental catastrophe measured in the hundreds of millions of animals. Faced with this furry, relentless apocalypse, the government of Western Australia reached for a solution of genuinely staggering ambition, if somewhat questionable timing. They decided to build a fence, not a modest garden barrier, but an enormous structure stretching from the northern coastline all the way down to the southern coast, designed specifically to hold the advancing rabbits back and protect the state's western farmland. In its longest continuous stretch, the barrier ran for more than 1,000 miles, making it, for a time, the longest continuous fence anywhere in the world. It was patrolled by dedicated boundary riders who traveled its length on camel, on horseback, and eventually by bicycle, endlessly repairing breaks and clearing drifting sand from its base. There was, however, one small and rather heartbreaking flaw baked into the entire plan. Rabbits, it turns out, do not politely wait for a fence to be finished before crossing over. By the time construction was actually completed, a fair number of the very rabbits the barrier was meant to exclude had already slipped past the work crews and established themselves comfortably on what was supposed to be the protected side. It was, in effect, the ecological equivalent of locking your front door only after the burglars had already let themselves in, made themselves at home, and put the kettle on for tea. The fence still served some genuine purpose, but its grand original promise had been quietly undercut before the final post was ever driven into the ground. The long war against the rabbits dragged on for generations, eventually escalating into biological weaponry in the form of deliberately introduced diseases, which finally managed to knock the population back from catastrophic to merely enormous. But the rabbits never fully left, and by every indication, they never will. Every part of the story, the ruined farmland, the vanished native burrows, the 1,000 miles of desperately maintained wire, traces back to a small handful of animals released by one homesick man who simply fancied a bit of weekend hunting. Somewhere in the great ledger of history's worst ideas sits a modest, almost quaint entry that reads, in essence, "Brought some rabbits over just for fun," now to a mystery with no tidy resolution at all. On a warm December day in 1967, the sitting Prime Minister of Australia, Harold Holt, went for a swim at a beach near Melbourne known for its rough surf and dangerous currents. He waded into the water. The sea was churning that day, and he was never seen again, not injured and recovered, not found washed ashore later, simply gone without a trace in front of witnesses on a Sunday afternoon. It remains one of the strangest chapters in the country's entire political history, and in a twist so darkly absurd it sounds almost invented, a public swimming pool complex was later built and named in his memory. Holt was no reckless beginner splashing around beyond his depth. By every account, he was a confident, genuinely experienced swimmer who knew that particular stretch of coastline well, and had swum there many times before, fully aware of its reputation for powerful currents. On that particular Sunday, he had gone down to the shore with a small group of companions, and despite the surf being visibly rough that day, he waded in for a swim regardless. The sea was churning hard, the conditions were undeniably dangerous, and within moments, the small group watching from shore saw him pulled under and out of view. The ocean simply took him quietly, completely, in broad daylight, with witnesses standing right there. What followed was one of the largest search operations the country had ever mounted for a single missing person. Police divers, Navy personnel, helicopters, boats, and volunteers combed the coastline and the surrounding waters for days on end. They found absolutely nothing. No body, no clothing, no definitive answer of any kind. For a nation to lose its sitting head of government was already shocking enough. For that same government to simply vanish into the sea without leaving so much as a trace behind was almost impossible for the public to fully process. There was no assassination to investigate, no sudden illness, no dramatic collapse in the halls of office. There was only a beach, some unusually rough surf, and then an aching absence where a prime minister had been standing only minutes before. Nature famously abhors a vacuum, and the human imagination abhors an unexplained one even more fiercely. Into that silence rushed a flood of conspiracy theories, each one more colorful than the last. The most gloriously outlandish claimed that Holt had secretly been a foreign intelligence agent the entire time, and that he had deliberately swum out to meet a waiting submarine that spirited him away to a foreign power under cover of the chaos. Others whispered about fake deaths, hidden second lives, and secret motives layered beneath the official story. In reality, the far more likely and far sadder explanation remains the simplest one available. An experienced swimmer entered dangerous water on an unusually bad day, and the ocean did exactly what a dangerous ocean does under those conditions. The absence of a recovered body in seas that rough and that deep is a genuine tragedy, but it isn't actually much of a mystery when you consider the physical conditions involved. Then comes the detail that pushes this entire story from simple tragedy into something bordering on the surreal. Sometime after his disappearance, a large public aquatic center, an entire swimming pool complex, was constructed and formally named in his honor. A memorial swimming facility dedicated to the memory of a man who had drowned at sea. It was, by every indication, intended with completely genuine respect and affection. And yet the sheer, almost comic awkwardness of that particular pairing has kept people shaking their heads in disbelief ever since. Of all the ways a nation might choose to memorialize a lost leader, an official venue built specifically for swimming feels like a decision made by someone who simply didn't think the whole sentence through to its logical end. And so Harold Holt occupies a genuinely peculiar place in the historical record. A leader remembered today less for his actual policies in office, and more for the sheer astonishing manner of his final exit. He went out for an ordinary Sunday swim and simply stepped straight out of the world entirely, leaving behind an empty office, an unanswerable question that has never been fully resolved, and a swimming center that carries his name to this day. Some leaders leave behind grand monuments built to their triumphs. He left behind a mystery, and a very strange place indeed to swim your daily laps. By the 1920s, a spiny South American cactus known as the prickly pear, originally brought over decades earlier as nothing more than a charming garden ornamental and a convenient, low-maintenance living fence, had gone completely and catastrophically rogue across the Australian countryside. It had spread across huge stretches of Queensland and New South Wales until it blanketed an area of land larger than many entire countries on the map, choking farms, swallowing fence lines, and rendering vast tracts of once productive land utterly useless for anything at all. Nothing the settlers tried seemed able to stop it. And then, in a move that seemed almost absurdly small in scale compared to the size of the problem, scientists turned to an unlikely hero, a small, unremarkable species of moth whose caterpillars happened to have a ferocious, singular appetite for exactly this cactus and almost nothing else. Released carefully in the late 1920s, this humble insect chewed its way through the invasion so thoroughly and so completely that grateful local towns eventually built a permanent monument in its honor. The prickly pear had arrived, like so many of these stories, with the very best of intentions behind it. It was a hardy, low-maintenance plant, genuinely useful for growing thick, thorny living hedges that kept livestock contained without the expense of proper fencing, and it had also once been used to help feed a particular insect that was farmed for a valuable red dye. It thrived in the Australian climate with remarkable ease. It thrived, in fact, far too well for anyone's comfort. Freed entirely from the natural predators, diseases, and competing plants that had kept it in balance back in its native South America, the cactus began spreading with a quiet, relentless, almost mathematical determination. Its thick, fleshy pads would drop to the ground on their own and simply root wherever they landed, with each individual fragment fully capable of growing into an entirely new, independent plant. There was no need for seeds, no need for careful cultivation. The plant essentially propagated itself endlessly, one fallen pad at a time, spreading outward in every direction with each passing season. At the very peak of the infestation, the scale of the problem was almost beyond ordinary comprehension. Tens of millions of acres of land lay buried beneath dense, impenetrable thickets of spiny growth, in places tall and thick enough to swallow entire fences, farm sheds, and the occasional unlucky, unwary animal that wandered too close. Enormous stretches of what had once been genuinely productive farmland became worthless almost overnight, quietly abandoned to the relentless advance of the cactus. Entire families walked away from properties that had, quite literally, vanished beneath the spines, leaving behind homes and fields their families had built with years of hard labor. People tried absolutely everything they could think of to fight the invasion back. They hacked at it by hand with axes and machetes. They set it alight with controlled burns. They doused it with tons upon tons of chemical poison, spending enormous sums of scarce colonial money in the process. And still, the prickly pear simply grew back, seemingly mocking every single effort thrown against it. It was, in every practical sense, a slow, spreading green tide, and for a long time it was clearly and steadily winning the war. In growing desperation, the authorities eventually turned away from brute mechanical and chemical force entirely, and pivoted instead toward biology, searching the wider world for some natural enemy that might succeed where machinery, fire, and poison had all comprehensively failed. Their search eventually settled on a small, modest moth native to South America, whose larvae fed voraciously on prickly pear cactus and on very little else, making it a promising and remarkably specific candidate for the job. It was, by any honest assessment, a genuine gamble. Deliberately importing one foreign species specifically to control another already introduced species had, by this point in the colony's short history, a decidedly mixed and often disastrous track record, as the earlier stories of both the cane toads and the rabbits would have loudly and bitterly attested, had anyone thought to ask them. But this time, remarkably, against the weight of recent history, it actually worked. And it worked beautifully, almost gracefully. Eggs were laid by the millions across the heavily infested regions of Queensland and New South Wales, and when the tiny caterpillars finally hatched from those eggs, they burrowed directly into the soft, fleshy pads of the cactus and proceeded to eat the plant slowly from the inside out. Thicket after thicket, acre after acre, began to collapse into rot and slow ruin as the larvae tunneled steadily through the plant tissue, hollowing the cacti out from within until they simply slumped over and died where they stood. Within just a handful of years, land that had been considered permanently lost for an entire generation of farmers was suddenly clear again, opened back up for genuine farming and resettlement. The transformation across the landscape was so dramatic and so complete that families who had long since given up on their old properties actually returned to find them fully liberated from the cactus that had swallowed them whole. The gratitude that followed was entirely genuine, and true to a certain wonderfully specific local fashion, it was expressed in the most delightfully literal way imaginable. In one small Queensland community, the local residents built an entire public hall and formally dedicated it to the moth that had single-handedly saved their farms and their livelihoods. A memorial hall, built and named in honor of a caterpillar. It stands today as possibly the only building anywhere in the world raised specifically in tribute to an insect, for services rendered in a long and difficult war against an invasive cactus. So while the cane toad remains, to this day, the great cautionary tale of introduced species gone catastrophically wrong, the humble cactus moth stands as its quiet, gentle counterpoint, the rare invited guest that did precisely what it was asked to do, and then some. One country, two remarkably similar experiments, launched under strikingly similar reasoning, and two entirely opposite results. Sometimes the gamble ruins you completely. And sometimes, against all odds, it earns you a public hall with your name proudly attached to it, even if you happen to be a moth, and cannot actually read the plaque. Somewhere out in the Australian bush at this very moment, a wombat is quietly and unassumingly achieving something that no other known animal on the entire planet can manage. It is producing droppings that emerge shaped like tidy, geometric little cubes, not merely roughly cubish or approximately blocky, but genuinely squared off. Complete with distinct flat sides, almost as though some tiny internal factory were carefully pressing each one into shape before releasing it into the world. For a very long time, this claim was written off by most people as one of nature's odder rural rumors, precisely the sort of tall tale you'd assume had been invented around a campfire late one night and simply never corrected. But scientists eventually confirmed that it was, in fact, entirely true, and then went on to spend a genuinely impressive and rather admirable amount of dedicated research energy trying to figure out exactly how a soft, round-bodied animal manages to manufacture such reliably geometric results from something as unglamorous as digestive waste. The wombat itself does remarkably little to prepare an observer for this particular hidden talent. It is a sturdy, low-slung, heavily built burrowing marsupial, with roughly the general build, temperament, and visual charm of a furry ottoman that has learned to walk. It is the sort of animal that looks, at a glance, as though it was designed purely to be slow, gentle, and mildly affectionate, with absolutely nothing about its outward appearance suggesting any hidden talent whatsoever for producing precision-engineered biological waste. And yet a single wombat, working through a single night, can produce dozens upon dozens of these small, neat cubes, scattering them methodically across its territory with the completely casual confidence of an animal that has no conscious idea it is doing anything remotely unusual by the standards of the rest of the animal kingdom. The obvious question, of course, is simply, why? Why would evolution ever bother shaping an animal's droppings into cubes in the first place, of all the possible shapes available? The leading scientific explanation turns out to be refreshingly, almost charmingly practical. Wombats use their droppings as a genuine form of territorial marking and long-distance communication with other wombats in the area. And crucially, they strongly prefer to leave these particular messages perched prominently on top of rocks, fallen logs, and small raised mounds, precisely where other wombats passing through are most likely to notice them. A perfectly round dropping placed on top of a sloped rock would, naturally, tend to roll straight off and be lost entirely, its intended message never delivered. A cube, on the other hand, simply stays exactly where it was placed, refusing to roll away no matter how uneven or angled the surface beneath it happens to be. The wombat has, in effect, evolved its own particular form of waste that quite literally will not roll off its intended billboard. It is, in a very real sense, nature's own peculiar answer to the humble sticky note. The bigger and more genuinely puzzling mystery, though, was always the mechanical question of how. How exactly does a soft, flexible, tube-shaped section of intestine manage to produce a hard-edged, genuinely geometric solid object at the far end of the digestive process? For a remarkably long time, this particular detail thoroughly stumped researchers who looked into it. The eventual answer, once scientists finally worked it out through careful study, turned out to be every bit as elegant as it was genuinely strange. The wombat, it turns out, has an unusually long and highly efficient digestive tract, and it extracts water from its food with an extraordinary degree of thoroughness, so that by the time the digested material finally reaches the very final stretch of the intestine, it has become remarkably dry, dense, and firm in consistency. That crucial final section of the gut, researchers discovered, is not uniform in its structure at all. Its inner walls vary noticeably in both stiffness and elasticity around the full circumference of the tube, with certain areas being considerably more stretchy and pliable than others directly beside them. As the increasingly dry, firming contents are steadily squeezed along by ordinary muscular contractions, these alternating zones of varying elasticity gradually shape the material into flattened faces and clearly defined corners, molding it patiently into a genuine cube shape well before it ever actually leaves the animal's body. The discovery itself was considered so delightfully odd, and so genuinely clever in its underlying explanation, that the research team responsible for finally solving the mystery was honored with a light-hearted, tongue-in-cheek scientific award specifically celebrating research that first makes people laugh, and only afterward makes them stop and genuinely think. It is difficult, honestly, to imagine a more fitting or more perfectly matched prize than that one for a study dedicated entirely to explaining the underlying physics of square wombat droppings. What makes the entire phenomenon so quietly wonderful, in the end, is the sheer pointless perfection of it all. The wombat never actually needed to be this interesting a creature. It could easily have gotten by perfectly well with completely ordinary round droppings, exactly like nearly every other mammal on the planet manages just fine. Instead, through the slow, patient, unhurried work of evolution over countless generations, it developed its own peculiar internal geometry that quietly and effortlessly outperforms most human attempts at making a genuinely clean, sharp corner by hand. So the next time you find yourself struggling to fold a fitted bedsheet into a neat square, or fighting to properly align the corners of absolutely anything at all, spare a small thought for the humble wombat, waddling calmly through the darkness of the outback, effortlessly manufacturing flawless little cubes one after another, and remaining entirely, blissfully unimpressed with itself the whole time for doing so. When Australia's separate, previously independent colonies formally joined together as a single unified nation back in 1901, virtually everyone involved agreed immediately on the basic need for an official national capital city. What absolutely nobody could agree on, however, was exactly where that capital should actually be located. Sydney insisted, loudly and repeatedly, that the obvious and only sensible choice was Sydney itself. Melbourne insisted, with equal volume and equal conviction, that the honor should just as obviously belong to Melbourne instead. The two cities were such genuinely fierce, long-standing rivals that neither one was remotely willing to accept watching the other city win this particular contest. So, rather than actually resolve the dispute through negotiation or compromise, The nation's founders reached instead for a wonderfully petty solution of their very own. They would simply build an entirely brand new capital city completely from scratch, out in the empty countryside, positioned roughly halfway between the two feuding rivals. That deliberately invented city eventually became Canberra, a purpose-built national capital designed, at its core, largely just to stop two quarreling cities from continuing to bicker indefinitely. The long-running rivalry between Sydney and Melbourne was, and quite frankly still remains today, something close to a genuine national sport in its own right. Sydney was the older of the two settlements, the original founding colony, brash, coastal, and thoroughly certain of its own historical importance and precedence. Melbourne, meanwhile, had grown enormously and rapidly wealthy on the back of a major 19th century gold rush, and considered itself, in turn, to be the more refined, more cultured, and generally more deserving of the honor of becoming the nation's capital. Each city regarded the other with roughly the warm, generous affection of two siblings locked in permanent competition over who gets the better seat at dinner. Handing the official title of national capital to either city outright would have amounted to an unbearable, lasting humiliation for whichever city lost out, and both sides were fully prepared to sulk about the outcome more or less indefinitely if forced to accept defeat. The eventual solution, written directly into the country's founding constitutional framework, was a genuine masterpiece of diplomatic evasion dressed up carefully as even-handed fairness. The new capital would be located within the borders of the single most populous colony, New South Wales, which allowed Sydney's civic pride to remain technically, nominally intact. But crucially, the new capital also had to be positioned a specific minimum distance away from Sydney itself, far enough that the city could not simply claim the prize through sheer geographic proximity alone. Melbourne, for its part, was handed a generous consolation prize in the meantime. It would serve as the temporary seat of the national government, hosting the country's parliament for years on end, while the actual permanent capital was slowly, painstakingly conjured into existence out of empty farmland many miles away. And empty farmland it genuinely was. The site eventually chosen for this brand new capital was a quiet stretch of open sheep grazing country, a peaceful valley of paddocks and rolling hills, with no existing city infrastructure, no grand public buildings, and very little at all to particularly recommend it beyond the simple fact that its location managed to annoy neither Sydney nor Melbourne too severely. An international design competition was formally held to plan the future capital entirely from the ground up, and the winning vision ultimately came from a husband-and-wife team of American architects, whose sweeping, elaborate geometric master plan arranged the entire future city around ornamental artificial lakes, wide radiating boulevards, and carefully positioned traffic circles. It was, in every meaningful sense, a city imagined completely on paper long before a single significant building of any kind actually existed on the ground. Progress on the ground was frustratingly slow, and the new capital took many years to grow into anything genuinely resembling a fully functioning center of national government. For a considerable stretch of time, it was openly mocked in the press and in casual conversation as a sleepy, half-finished country town, a place where elected politicians were reluctantly posted for duty, and from which they fled gratefully at the very first available opportunity. Even the city's eventual name, settled only after a great deal of prolonged public debate, was deliberately chosen specifically because it sounded suitably neutral and inoffensive to all parties involved. The entire enterprise carried a faint, unmistakable air of a nation building an entirely separate spare bedroom purely so that two quarreling houseguests would finally stop fighting over the good one. Over the following decades, naturally, Canberra gradually filled in and matured. It gained its permanent parliament building, its national museums and institutions, its ornamental lake, and eventually a genuine resident population who actually live and work there year-round, going about perfectly ordinary daily lives. It became a real, fully functioning capital city in every practical sense, regardless of the many lingering jokes about its excessive roundabouts and its heavy concentration of public servants. But its origin story has never quite managed to shed its underlying comedy. This is, in the end, a capital city that exists not because of any great natural harbor, sacred historical site, or strategically vital crossroads, but simply because two proud rival cities were far too stubborn to ever let the other one win. It stands, in the end, as a monument to compromise in its most literal, most physically constructed possible form. Faced with a long-running dispute it genuinely could not resolve through ordinary means, an entire young nation instead simply built a brand new city out in an empty paddock and quietly moved its government there. And somewhere to this day, both Sydney and Melbourne likely remain privately, quietly certain that they were the ones who truly deserved the job all along. During the depths of the Second World War, one of the more chaotic and thoroughly unexpected battles fought on Australian soil was not waged against any invading enemy nation at all. It was fought instead between friends and allies. In 1942, simmering tensions between Australian and American servicemen stationed together in the city of Brisbane, tensions that had been quietly building for months over pay disparities, competition over local women, and a broader, deepening sense of general resentment, finally boiled over into 2 consecutive nights of open brawling in the city streets. Thousands of soldiers who were, at least technically, fighting on precisely the same side of the same global war spent those evenings instead throwing punches, hurling bottles, and generally wrestling one another through the streets of a major Australian city. It was messy. It was deeply embarrassing for military command on both sides, and it was quietly, thoroughly hushed up at the time specifically so as not to damage the fragile wartime alliance and public morale. The broader backdrop to the whole affair was a strange and genuinely uneasy historical moment. With much of the Pacific theater in complete turmoil, enormous numbers of American troops had poured steadily into Australia, using the country as a vital forward staging base for their broader campaign. This influx was, in every honest sense, a decidedly mixed blessing for ordinary Australians living through it. On one hand, the Americans were welcome allies, badly needed reinforcements arriving during a genuinely frightening period of the war. On the other hand, they arrived with noticeably better pay, sharper and more impressive uniforms, considerably more disposable money to spend on local entertainment, and a certain easy, confident swagger that grated steadily on Australian nerves over time. Many Australian servicemen, meanwhile, were away fighting elsewhere entirely, which left their home city full of well-funded visiting soldiers who seemed, by every visible measure, to be having a considerably better time of the war than the locals themselves. There was a popular phrase at the time that captured this local resentment with remarkable cutting precision. The complaint that the visiting Americans were overpaid, oversexed, and most damningly of all in the local phrasing, over here. The visiting troops could comfortably afford nicer gifts and nights out, could treat local Australian women to evenings the local men simply couldn't match on their own military pay, and enjoyed regular access to well-stocked American canteens full of goods that ordinary rationed Australians could barely find anywhere during wartime. Combine generous quantities of alcohol, wounded local pride, open competition over romantic attention, and thousands of young men in uniform all packed tightly into one mid-sized city, and you have, in essence, a genuine powder keg sitting on an extremely short fuse. The explosion, when it finally came, arrived over 2 consecutive nights in late November of that year. It began, fittingly enough given the underlying tensions, near a canteen reserved specifically for American servicemen, a location that in itself symbolized everything the local Australian troops had come to resent. An ordinary argument between individual servicemen quickly escalated. A crowd gathered around the growing confrontation, and the entire situation tipped rapidly, almost within minutes, from a minor scuffle into a full-scale street riot. Australian and American soldiers alike surged out into the streets by the thousands, fists flying freely, bottles smashing against walls and pavement, and the confrontation spilling outward across a significant portion of the city center. Military police on both sides struggled badly to bring the chaos back under any kind of control, and in the confusion of that first violent night, the situation turned genuinely deadly, with one Australian serviceman killed and numerous others on both sides left seriously injured. The second night saw further violence flare back up as roaming groups of soldiers went looking for revenge, though tighter security measures eventually managed to bring the worst of the mayhem back under a lid before it could spiral any further out of control. When the dust finally settled, the overall toll included one confirmed death, a substantial number of serious injuries on both sides, and a considerable amount of property damage, along with significant, lasting damage to the carefully cultivated public image of complete Allied unity that both governments were eager to maintain. This was, in the plainest possible terms, precisely the kind of story that wartime authorities on both sides could simply not afford to let spread freely. With the entire war effort depending so heavily on the strength of the Allied partnership, and public morale hanging by an already thin thread, the absolute last thing either government wanted was newspaper headlines openly announcing that supposed allies had spent 2 consecutive nights beating each other senseless in the streets of a major Australian city. So the entire affair was firmly and deliberately censored at the time, kept carefully out of the newspapers, and quietly tucked away from public knowledge. For many years afterward, it lingered on only as a half-remembered local rumor rather than an openly acknowledged historical event. A brawl that had, officially at least, never actually happened. Only much later did the full, detailed account of the incident finally emerge into public historical record. And so it takes its place today among the country's stranger and more uncomfortable wartime episodes. Not a battle fought against any invading foreign force, but a 2-night brawl between supposed comrades, fueled by envy, romantic competition, and simmering resentment, fought with fists and broken bottles instead of rifles and artillery. For those 2 chaotic evenings in Brisbane, the enemy, for once, was standing on precisely the same side of the war. Stretching out across the vast, empty distances of the Australian outback is a fence so extraordinarily long that it genuinely defies easy comprehension. The dingo fence, built specifically to keep Australia's wild native dingoes away from the valuable sheep farming regions of the southeast, runs for more than 5,000 kilometers in total, making it, by most measures, one of the longest continuous structures ever constructed anywhere by human hands. It crosses vast open deserts and dry scrubland alike, requiring dedicated teams of workers to patrol and repair sections of it more or less endlessly, forever. Standing directly beside it at almost any point along its length, you can look in either direction and simply watch the wire fence vanish gradually toward the far horizon in both directions. An enormous, continuous line drawn deliberately across an entire continent, purely to referee a long-running dispute between wild dogs and domesticated sheep. The underlying logic behind building something this extreme is, at least, genuinely understandable once you consider the stakes involved. Dingoes are Australia's native wild dogs, highly efficient natural hunters, perfectly adapted to life in the harsh interior, and a single determined pack can inflict devastating losses on an unprotected flock of sheep in a remarkably short time. For the graziers of the southeast, whose entire livelihoods depended directly on healthy wool and lamb production, the dingo represented a relentless, ever-present 4-legged threat to their income. Attempting to fence off just a single individual property against this threat proved essentially hopeless, since determined dingoes would simply travel around any localized barrier. So the proposed solution kept scaling upward, and upward again, until the eventual answer became a single barrier long enough to effectively seal off an entire substantial chunk of the country from the rest. The finished result is a fence of genuinely ridiculous, almost unbelievable ambition. It winds its way steadily across 3 separate states, threading carefully through some of the most remote and thoroughly inhospitable terrain imaginable anywhere on the continent. From deep red desert to dry open plain to dense scrubby bushland. In its longest single continuous stretch, it comfortably dwarfs almost any comparable man-made structure found anywhere else on Earth, easily outmeasuring even the most famous ancient walls, which took entire empires' generations of dedicated labor to construct. And unlike those ancient historical walls, which today stand largely as crumbling tourist monuments to be quietly photographed and admired, this fence has an actual, genuine working job to perform every single day, with no possibility whatsoever of ever being allowed to retire from active duty. Keeping a structure of this scale standing at all is a genuinely relentless, almost mythologically difficult undertaking. Strong desert winds routinely bury entire sections of it beneath drifting sand. Kangaroos and wandering wombats regularly blunder straight into it, tearing fresh holes through the wire mesh. Sudden floods periodically wash entire sections away without warning. Extreme heat steadily warps the metal over time, and the dingoes themselves probe constantly, endlessly, for any weak point or gap they can exploit. To hold this impossibly long line in place, dedicated boundary riders and maintenance crews patrol enormous, exhausting stretches of it on a permanent rotating schedule, driving vast distances daily just to mend individual breaks and clear away accumulated debris. A job carrying roughly the same grim appeal as endlessly repainting a bridge that structurally never actually stops needing fresh paint. By the time one exhausted crew finally finishes patching up one distant end of the fence, the opposite end has typically already begun quietly falling apart again. There is something almost strangely poetic buried within the entire enterprise, when you step back and consider it properly. Human settlers looked out at the existing natural order of the continent, decided unilaterally that the dingoes belonged firmly on the wrong side of a line that did not yet exist anywhere in reality, and then proceeded to spend multiple full generations of sustained labor physically drawing that exact line across an entire continent, using nothing more than wire and wooden posts. It stands today as one of the largest examples anywhere in the world of one single species, deliberately rearranging an entire landscape, simply to settle a long-running argument with another animal entirely. The local kangaroo population, incidentally, has developed its own strong opinions on the matter too, since the fence also directly shapes where they themselves are able to freely roam, and has quietly, gradually reshaped the surrounding ecology on both sides of the barrier over time. Whether the fence has genuinely earned back its staggering ongoing construction and maintenance cost remains a debate that has honestly never fully settled down. It certainly does measurably reduce dingo attacks on livestock within the protected southeastern side. But critics consistently point to the complex, tangled downstream ecological effects of effectively removing a top natural predator from roughly half of an entire continent's worth of territory. Nature, as always, stubbornly refuses to be neatly divided up by a simple line of wire, no matter how long that line happens to be. Still, there it stands regardless, a genuine monument to sheer human stubbornness, stretching further than the eye can comfortably follow, further than most ordinary journeys, further than seems entirely reasonable for any single structure built for any purpose whatsoever. A fence so extraordinarily long that it becomes genuinely difficult to hold its full scale in your mind at once, built and continuously maintained at truly enormous ongoing effort, also that sheep and wild dogs alike might keep, quite literally, to their own respective sides of an invisible line drawn deliberately across the desert. In the scorching, sun-hammered heart of South Australia, sits a small mining town that took one honest look at the local surface temperature and made the entirely sensible decision to simply move underground instead. Coober Pedy is an opal mining settlement where the daytime heat regularly becomes so genuinely brutal that many residents have taken to carving their actual homes, along with local churches, shops, and even hotels, directly into the surrounding hillsides and disused old mine tunnels. Down there in the cool, dim, sheltered earth, ordinary daily life carries on quite comfortably, complete with proper beds, functioning kitchens, and furnished living rooms, all tucked safely beneath thick layers of protective rock. It is a genuinely unusual place where the simple phrase "going home" for most residents means literally descending down into the ground, and where the town's true architectural skyline remains almost entirely hidden from ordinary view above the surface. The underlying reason people first came to this remote, blisteringly hot patch of desert in significant numbers was, quite simply, opal, and a great deal of it. Beneath the region's dry, cracked, unremarkable-looking surface landscape lay some of the richest and most valuable opal deposits found anywhere on the entire planet. And wherever genuine treasure like that happens to be buried, there will always be people willing to endure almost any hardship necessary to dig it up. The considerable trouble in this particular case was the climate itself. Summers in this part of South Australia are genuinely savage, with surface temperatures capable of turning the exposed ground into something uncomfortably close to a literal oven. The kind of oppressive heat that makes the simple act of stepping outside during the day feel like a fairly serious tactical mistake. Attempting to sleep above ground in that kind of relentless furnace proved miserable at best and could turn genuinely dangerous at worst. So the miners, who were already highly skilled at tunneling efficiently into the earth in search of valuable gems, simply applied those exact same practical skills towards solving the far more urgent, immediate problem of not slowly cooking alive in their own beds. If the ground itself stayed noticeably cooler just a few meters down below the scorching surface, the miners reasoned with straightforward practicality, then that was clearly where they ought to be living instead. They began carving out proper living chambers directly into the surrounding soft rock, quickly discovering along the way that the surrounding earth itself acted as remarkably effective natural insulation, holding a steady, genuinely comfortable temperature all year round, regardless of how furiously the sun happened to be raging on the surface directly overhead. While the exposed surface baked mercilessly above, the carved-out dugout spaces below stayed pleasantly, reliably mild, with absolutely no mechanical air conditioning required at any point. What began as fairly rough, purely functional emergency shelter gradually grew, over time, into something genuinely remarkable and increasingly sophisticated. The underground dwellings steadily developed into proper, fully realized homes, some of them genuinely spacious and comfortable, complete with dedicated lounge rooms, multiple bedrooms, and every one of the ordinary trappings of everyday domestic life, just with solid rock walls in place of conventional windows and outside views. Enterprising local residents eventually expanded the underlying concept far beyond simple housing alone. There are now fully carved underground churches, built with genuine care and real architectural reverence, their smooth interior walls carved directly and carefully from the surrounding living stone. There are underground shops, underground hotels catering specifically to curious visiting travelers, underground galleries, and various underground community gathering spaces, all hollowed out patiently beneath the surrounding desert surface. An entire functioning community effectively learned, over multiple generations, how to conduct nearly all of its everyday business comfortably in the cool, sheltered darkness below, while the world directly above continued to shimmer and bake relentlessly in the ever-present heat. There is a genuinely wonderful, almost charming practicality running through the whole arrangement. If a local family decides they would like an additional bedroom for a growing household, They do not need to build any kind of conventional external extension onto their existing home. They simply dig one instead, tunneling a little further into the surrounding rock, and quite often, delightfully, uncovering a small additional seam of valuable opal somewhere along the way in the process. It is quite possibly the only place anywhere on Earth where ordinary home renovations can occasionally turn a modest profit in raw gemstones. Above ground, meanwhile, the town itself looks almost entirely abandoned under the fierce midday daylight, with little more visible than a scattering of ventilation shafts and mine entrances poking up out of the barren, sun-baked earth, giving remarkably little outward hint of the busy, comfortable warren of genuine daily life humming quietly away just beneath the surface. The whole place carries a distinctly otherworldly visual quality about it, so much so that it has repeatedly served as a convincing filming backdrop for movies, specifically needing a landscape that looks convincingly like the cratered, dusty surface of another planet entirely. It is genuinely easy to understand why filmmakers keep returning to it. There is, in the end, something profoundly and genuinely strange about an entire town where all the actual living happens carefully below ground, while empty, sun-baked silence simply sits on top. But strange as the underlying arrangement undeniably is, it also makes complete and total practical sense once you understand the reasoning behind it. Faced with a local climate absolutely determined to roast them alive on the surface, the residents of Kuber Peti chose not to fight the desert directly at all. They simply moved calmly downward into the cool, sheltered earth instead, and quietly let the relentless heat continue raging on undisturbed, safely out of sight, and more importantly still, largely out of mind. On a night in August of 1980, a family camping near the Great Red Monolith of Uluru reported something that sounded, on its face, almost impossible to believe. Their infant daughter, only a few weeks old, had been taken directly from the family tent by a dingo while the family slept nearby. The nation, as a whole, largely did not believe the mother's account. Her outwardly calm demeanor in the aftermath was picked apart relentlessly in the press. Wild, increasingly elaborate theories swirled through public conversation for years, and she was eventually tried, convicted of murder and sent to prison, all while she continued to insist, without ever once wavering, that a wild dingo truly had carried her baby away that night. Years later, entirely new physical evidence finally emerged. Her conviction was formally overturned, and a coroner ultimately, officially confirmed the very same account the mother had given from that very first terrible night. A dingo genuinely had taken the child, exactly as she had said all along. What makes this particular story linger so persistently in the national memory, and what makes it genuinely worth revisiting carefully and gently, is not simply the underlying tragedy itself, but the truly extraordinary way an entire country collectively decided it somehow knew better than the grieving parent standing directly at the center of it. From the very beginning, the mother's account of events was met not with basic sympathy or compassion, but instead with immediate, widespread suspicion. In an era before most people fully understood or accepted that wild dingoes were genuinely capable of taking a small child from a campsite, the entire explanation simply sounded far too outlandish for the public to comfortably accept at face value. And so, rather than sit with something genuinely difficult and frightening to believe, a great deal of the public reached instead for something psychologically far more comfortable, quietly deciding, without real evidence, that the mother herself must be lying about what had actually happened. Her supposed great crime, in the harsh court of public opinion at the time, turned out to be that she simply did not fall apart emotionally in the specific, expected way that observers assumed a grieving mother was obligated to perform for onlookers and cameras. She held herself together outwardly. She spoke about the events plainly and directly, without visible dramatic collapse. She did not perform her private grief publicly in the exact manner people had unconsciously come to expect. This particular composure, which is, in reality, simply one of many entirely normal, valid ways that different human beings cope with genuinely unbearable personal loss, was instead widely treated by the public and press as damning evidence of underlying guilt. Rumors filled the resulting vacuum rapidly. Cruel, baseless theories took firm hold in the public imagination. And a family already devastated by unimaginable loss found itself further hunted relentlessly by gossip and public suspicion, rather than being offered any real comfort or basic compassion during an already unbearable time. The case quickly became something close to a genuine national obsession, endlessly dissected and relitigated at dinner tables and in newspaper columns across the entire country for years on end. The forensic evidence presented at the original criminal trial, evidence later shown conclusively to have been deeply flawed in multiple significant respects, appeared at the time to strongly support the public's existing doubts, and the mother was ultimately found guilty and sent to prison, all while she continued maintaining her original account of events without ever wavering from it. It stands today as one of the most notorious and widely studied miscarriages of justice in the country's entire legal history, a genuine case study in exactly how quickly and how thoroughly an entire public will convict someone essentially for the unforgivable sin of grieving in an unexpected way. Then, eventually, the ground genuinely shifted beneath the whole case. A small piece of the missing infant's clothing was discovered, entirely by chance, in a desert area heavily riddled with known dingo dens, lending sudden and substantial new weight to the very account that had been so thoroughly dismissed for years by both the public and the legal system. The original conviction was formally reviewed. The mother was released from prison. And slowly, painfully, over a period of additional years, the official legal record itself began the difficult process of correcting itself properly. It would take several more years still, along with multiple further formal inquiries, before the final definitive legal verdict finally, fully caught up with the underlying truth of the matter. In the end, a coroner formally and officially recorded exactly what the family had insisted, without wavering, from that very first terrible night. A dingo had genuinely taken the child. By that point, however, enormous and largely irreversible damage had already been done, not only to the grieving family itself, who had lost a daughter and then subsequently endured years of unwarranted public suspicion, a wrongful conviction and actual imprisonment, but also to the country's broader confidence in its own collective judgment and its legal institutions. A particular phrase associated closely with the case unfortunately became, over subsequent decades, something of a grim cultural punchline around the wider world, endlessly quoted and casually mocked by people who frequently had no real idea it actually described a genuine, devastating personal tragedy suffered by a real family. The truest lesson buried within the whole difficult ordeal is, in the end, a genuinely sobering one, largely hidden beneath decades of sensationalized retelling. Sometimes the explanation that initially sounds far too strange or outlandish to possibly be true turns out to simply be exactly what actually happened. A wild animal did something genuinely terrible that people at the time did not yet properly understand it was capable of doing, and an already grieving family was cruelly punished for the simple act of telling the complete truth. It ultimately took an entire nation far too long to finally admit that the mother had, in fact, been right all along. During the grim, difficult years of the Great Depression, an otherwise fairly ordinary-looking racehorse became something remarkably close to a genuine national savior for millions of struggling people. Farr lapped one race after race with such overwhelming, consistent dominance that he gave an entire struggling, downhearted country something genuinely uplifting to cheer for during an otherwise bleak economic period. He was, in every practical sense, hope running on four legs. Then, in 1932, while on an extended overseas trip to North America, Farr lapsed suddenly and violently fell seriously ill, and died within a remarkably short span of time. The public grief that followed was enormous and immediate, and so, almost as quickly, were the suspicions. Rumors of deliberate poisoning spread rapidly through the press and public conversation. Elaborate conspiracy theories bloomed almost overnight. And to this very day, people continue to genuinely argue and speculate over what actually killed the horse that an entire struggling nation had so completely taken into its collective heart. It is genuinely difficult to fully overstate just how much this particular animal came to mean to ordinary people during that specific period. The country as a whole was mired deeply in serious economic hardship at the time, with countless families out of steady work, personal savings entirely wiped out, and any real sense of hope in desperately short supply nationwide. Into this pervasive gloom galloped, quite unexpectedly, a big, rangy chestnut-colored horse with an entirely unremarkable early competitive record, who suddenly and dramatically began winning absolutely everything in sight, crushing his rivals in race after race with a kind of casual, overwhelming power that thrilled enormous crowds of ordinary spectators. In a world where almost nothing at all seemed to be going right for most people, here suddenly was one single shining, reliable thing that simply kept on winning, race after race. People who had genuinely never placed a single bet in their entire lives began actively following his races closely, and his repeated victories became small, precious, shared moments of collective public joy during an otherwise deeply difficult national period. His success ultimately grew so complete and so overwhelming that it began attracting darker, more troubling attention as well. Before one of the country's biggest and most prestigious races, there was reportedly a deliberate attempt made on the horse's life, a shooting incident from which he narrowly escaped without any lasting injury. That such a genuinely alarming thing could even happen at all tells you a great deal about exactly how high the financial stakes surrounding the horse had become by that point. A single racehorse had grown so consistently dominant and had become so enormously financially valuable to certain interested parties that some individuals were apparently willing to see real physical harm come to the animal rather than simply allow him to keep winning indefinitely. Then came the fateful overseas journey. Far Lap traveled across the Pacific specifically to race competitively in North America, and he continued to prove himself decisively there as well, winning a rich and genuinely prestigious international contest, and firmly cementing his growing reputation on the wider international stage. He had traveled to a completely unfamiliar distant country and comprehensively beaten the very best competitive horses it had to offer. And then, only a matter of days later, he suddenly fell gravely, seriously ill. Within a matter of hours, the once great champion horse was dead, his body having deteriorated with genuinely shocking, alarming speed. The entire nation back home was plunged immediately into deep public mourning, and almost immediately afterward, the difficult questions began circulating widely. How, people wondered, could a young, superbly fit, world-class champion die so abruptly, so suddenly, so far away from home, and so soon after his single greatest overseas triumph? Public suspicion fell almost instantly onto the possibility of deliberate foul play. Persistent whispers of intentional poisoning circulated widely, fueled heavily by genuine grief, general public disbelief, and a lingering, deep-seated sense that certain powerful interested parties may have had real reason to want him gone permanently. To a great many ordinary people at the time, it simply could not possibly have been mere coincidence. Later modern forensic analysis has actually added some genuinely intriguing additional weight to the long-standing poisoning theory, with subsequent scientific testing suggesting that the horse had indeed ingested a significant, measurable dose of a toxic substance sometime in the hours immediately preceding his sudden death. Though whether that particular exposure was the result of deliberate malice or simple accidental contamination remains, even now, genuinely unresolved by researchers. The underlying mystery has, as a direct result, never been fully or definitively closed, which is precisely why public fascination with the case continues to endure so strongly even today. What remains entirely beyond any real dispute, however, is the sheer extraordinary depth of public devotion the horse managed to inspire during his short life. Devotion so genuinely deep and lasting that, after his sudden death, his remarkable physical body was carefully preserved for future generations. His heart, discovered upon examination to be startlingly, unusually large for a horse of his size, was carefully preserved and studied afterward as a physical symbol of his outsized natural ability. And his mounted hide eventually became a treasured, permanently displayed museum exhibit, visited faithfully by successive generations of admirers ever since. So Phar Lap continues to gallop on, in a sense, through the wider historical record, existing simultaneously as both a beloved national champion and an enduring unsolved riddle. A horse who genuinely lifted an entire broken, struggling nation's spirits during its darkest economic period, and then died in a manner sudden and suspicious enough to keep people genuinely arguing and speculating for the better part of an entire century afterward. Some legends in the end are made entirely by winning. His legend, instead, was permanently sealed by an ending that nobody has ever been able to fully, satisfactorily explain. Australia's eucalyptus trees are tall, elegant, wonderfully fragrant to stand near, and as it happens, quietly packed throughout their leaves with a substantial quantity of natural oil. That final detail is precisely where things start to become genuinely alarming under the wrong circumstances. The very same aromatic oils that give the Australian bush its distinctive, instantly recognizable scent are also, unfortunately, highly flammable substances in their own right. So flammable, in fact, that during an intense bushfire, the vaporized oil released directly from the living trees can actually ignite explosively in the surrounding air itself. Under the very worst fire conditions, entire mature trees have been documented essentially bursting into flame with startling, sudden force, flinging burning debris well ahead of the main fire front, and directly helping the overall blaze leap forward across enormous, otherwise impassable distances in mere moments. It is one thing entirely to fear an ordinary forest fire in the abstract. It is quite another thing altogether to realize that the trees themselves are effectively serving as part of the fire's own ready ammunition supply. The eucalyptus, or gum tree as it's commonly known locally, stands as the single most defining, signature plant of the entire Australian landscape. Its distinctive silvery green leaves and characteristically peeling bark define much of the visual look and the unmistakable smell of the Australian bush as a whole. That famous, fresh, faintly medicinal aroma comes directly from volatile aromatic oils stored throughout the plant's foliage. The very same class of oils prized commercially for everything from traditional medicinal remedies to modern household cleaning products. Under entirely normal, everyday circumstances, these natural oils are simply pleasant to smell and largely harmless. Under the ferocious, extreme heat generated by an active bushfire, however, they transform into something else entirely. A natural, highly effective accelerant hanging invisibly in the very air surrounding each individual tree. Here is the genuinely frightening underlying mechanism at work. As an approaching fire draws closer and the surrounding ambient temperature climbs sharply, the intense heat actively drives the stored oils directly out of the leaves in the form of a highly flammable vapor, forming what amounts to an invisible cloud of combustible gas hanging around the tree's upper canopy. Once that accumulated vapor cloud finally reaches its specific ignition temperature, it can catch fire almost explosively all at once, meaning that instead of a fire slowly, gradually climbing upward branch by branch in the ordinary way, entire treetops can appear to detonate into open flame almost simultaneously. First-hand witness accounts from major historical bushfires consistently describe exactly this same phenomenon, trees seeming to genuinely explode into sudden balls of fire, with the resulting blaze then racing directly through the forest canopy at a speed no ordinary ground-level fire could ever hope to match. This particular fire behavior turns an already dangerous natural disaster into something bordering on a genuine nightmare for anyone attempting to fight it or flee from it in time. Because the most intense burning is happening high up in the oil-rich tree crowns themselves, the fire is capable of racing directly across the very tops of the trees in what firefighters specifically term a crown fire, comfortably outrunning fleeing people, moving vehicles, and constructed fire breaks positioned below at ground level. Worse still, the sheer intense heat generated actively hurls burning bark fragments, leaves, and glowing embers extraordinarily high up into the air, where prevailing winds then carry them far out ahead of the main fire front to ignite entirely fresh, separate blazes elsewhere. There is, underneath all of this danger, a genuinely grim underlying evolutionary logic at play, which is perhaps the strangest single element of the entire story. The eucalyptus has not simply become flammable purely by unfortunate accident. Over vast stretches of evolutionary time, many individual eucalyptus species have specifically adapted to actually thrive on regular fire exposure, using recurring natural blazes to clear away competing plant species and directly trigger the release of their own stored seeds. Certain specific species deliberately keep their seeds locked tightly away inside protective seed pods until the intense heat of an actual fire physically cracks those pods open, meaning that once the flames have finally passed through an area, the surviving gum trees are frequently among the very first plants to sprout vigorously again in the freshly cleared, ash-fertilized ground left behind. In effect, the tree has genuinely learned, over countless generations, to actively weaponize fire itself against its own plant rivals, all while simultaneously ensuring its own long-term survival and reproduction. So the beloved gum tree, the very defining emblem of the entire Australian bush, is also, at the very same time, a highly flammable, self-seeding, ember-throwing survivor that has essentially made a lasting evolutionary peace with fire by becoming a functional part of it. The exact same aromatic oils that make a peaceful eucalyptus grove smell so clean, sharp, and genuinely soothing on an ordinary calm day are precisely the same oils that can transform that same grove into a roaring, explosive inferno on a genuinely bad one. It stands as a sharp, memorable reminder that the Australian landscape does not merely passively tolerate danger in the abstract. It is, in a very real and literal sense, frequently built directly out of it. The pleasant scent drifting gently through a quiet, peaceful eucalyptus forest, fresh, sharp, and genuinely lovely to the senses, is, quite literally, the smell of a plant that stands entirely prepared under the right specific conditions to go up like a torch and take the surrounding neighborhood along with it. Off the coast of Western Australia, on a small and genuinely remote island, sits a lake that looks, at first glance, as though someone had simply poured an enormous strawberry milkshake directly into a hole in the ground. Lake Hillier presents itself in a vivid, entirely permanent, thoroughly unapologetic shade of bright bubblegum pink. So intensely pink, in fact, that when viewed from directly overhead in an aircraft, it appears almost cartoonishly saturated against the deep, ordinary blue of the surrounding ocean waters. Unlike a number of other so-called colored lakes found elsewhere around the world, which tend to shift in intensity with changing light conditions or the passing seasons, this particular lake stays consistently, reliably pink all year round without fail. Scientists studying the phenomenon have pointed to particular salt-loving microorganisms and specific species of algae as the most likely underlying culprits behind the color. But the sheer, saturated silliness of that vivid shade never quite stops looking almost entirely fake to anyone seeing it for the first time. The surrounding physical setting only heightens the overall strangeness of the scene even further. The lake itself sits on a small, isolated island fringed by pale white sand and dense, dark green woodland, with a vast, open expanse of blue southern ocean stretching away in every direction on all sides. Viewed from above, the entire scene looks noticeably less like an ordinary natural landscape and considerably more like a painting where the artist somehow got genuinely confused about which particular colors were supposed to go exactly where. There is the completely ordinary blue sea. There is the completely ordinary green woodland. There is the completely ordinary pale sandy shoreline. And then, sitting smugly right in the middle of all of it, there is a lake the exact color of a child's brightly colored party drink. The overall visual contrast is so genuinely stark that the whole scene almost looks deliberately staged for a photograph. When the lake was first encountered by early European explorers navigating along the coastline many generations ago, it was noted in their surviving records with obvious, genuine puzzlement. A bright pink body of open water being exactly the sort of unexpected discovery that makes even a seasoned, experienced navigator seriously question his own eyesight for a moment. Ever since that first recorded sighting, the lake has continued to draw considerable scientific fascination, and for a very long while afterward, the exact underlying cause of its distinctive color remained largely a matter of informal guesswork and open speculation among naturalists. The leading modern scientific explanation ultimately centers on the tiny forms of microscopic life that manage to flourish successfully within the lake's extremely salty water. The water itself is considerably saltier than the surrounding open ocean, salty enough, in fact, that very few ordinary organisms are capable of surviving in it at all. But certain unusually hardy organisms not only manage to cope reasonably well with these genuinely harsh saline conditions, they actively thrive under them. Among these resilient organisms is a particular type of algae that specifically produces reddish pigments as part of its normal biological processes, pigments belonging to the very same general family that lends its characteristic warm coloring to a number of other familiar natural substances. Alongside this algae live various salt-loving microbes that contribute their own additional rosy tint to the overall mixture. Together, working within the lake's intense combination of high salinity and strong regional sunlight, these various organisms combine to tint the entire body of water that remarkable, unmistakable shade of pink. What genuinely sets Lake Hillier apart from a number of other pink or reddish-tinted lakes found around the world is its stubborn, unwavering color consistency over time. Many other colored lakes elsewhere only blush noticeably at certain specific times of year, deepening or fading gradually depending on ambient temperature, seasonal rainfall, and shifting weather patterns, sometimes even reverting back to entirely plain, colorless water for large stretches of the calendar year. Lake Hillier, by clear contrast, simply commits fully to its color at all times. It reliably stays pink whether a visitor happens to arrive during the height of summer or during the depths of winter. Some visitor reports even suggest that if you personally scoop a sample of the water directly into a clear container, it faithfully retains its distinctive pink tint, even once removed from the lake itself, essentially allowing you to bottle up a small jar of pure natural nonsense to take home with you. Despite outwardly looking like something that absolutely should not be safe to touch under any circumstances, the water itself is entirely non-toxic and completely safe, and its distinctive coloring comes purely from entirely natural biological processes rather than from any form of industrial pollution or accidental chemical spill. Because the island itself is so remote and so carefully environmentally protected, remarkably few people ever actually get the opportunity to see the lake up close in person, and the vast majority of encounters with it happen instead from the air during scenic flights, which is arguably the single best possible vantage point from which to truly appreciate the full visual absurdity of that bright pink disk, set dramatically against the surrounding blue ocean and green woodland. It remains today one of the country's single most photographed natural oddities, precisely because it defies ordinary visual expectations so completely and so consistently. It stands in the end as nature operating at its most genuinely whimsical. A lake that looks entirely artificial, tastes of pure concentrated salt, and glows with a shameless, unapologetic pink hue, for no grander underlying reason than that the tiny organisms living quietly within it simply happen to prefer things arranged exactly that particular way. On New Year's Day back in 1915, a cheerful, festively decorated train packed full of local picnic-goers set off from the remote outback mining town of Broken Hill, its passengers dressed up in their finest and thoroughly looking forward to a relaxing, celebratory day out together. What none of those passengers could possibly have expected was to be violently ambushed along the way. Two local men, flying a homemade improvised flag and acting out of personal loyalty to the distant Ottoman Empire, which was, at that specific time, formally at war with Australia and its allies, opened deliberate gunfire on the open passenger carriages directly from beside the railway tracks as the train passed by. The resulting attack was every bit as bizarre in its underlying nature as it was genuinely tragic in its outcome. A distant global conflict from the far side of the world, erupting suddenly and violently in the middle of what should have been an entirely ordinary, sunny Australian holiday outing. To properly understand how such an unlikely event could possibly happen in a remote inland mining town, you really do have to picture the broader historical moment clearly in context. The First World War was, at that time, raging fiercely across the far side of the globe, and the Ottoman Empire had formally entered the wider conflict directly against Australia and its allied nations. Broken Hill itself sat about as far away from the actual European front lines as it was geographically possible to be anywhere on the continent. A dusty, thoroughly isolated regional center built around silver and lead mining, situated deep in the country's arid interior. It was precisely the sort of remote, sleepy place where the single biggest scheduled event of an entire year might reasonably be nothing more exciting than an organized community picnic outing. On the first day of that particular new year, several hundred local townsfolk crammed themselves cheerfully into open, festively decorated railway carriages for exactly such an outing, bound for a full day of relaxed holiday celebration together. The two eventual attackers were both local men, one who ordinarily made his modest living selling ice cream from a small mobile cart around town, and another who worked professionally with camels, animals that were still, at that particular time, regularly used for hauling heavy goods across the harsh, arid outback terrain. Moved by a strong personal sense of loyalty toward the distant Ottoman cause, the two men had independently decided to strike some kind of meaningful blow in its favor, using the only real means genuinely available to them out in the middle of the remote Australian desert, opening fire directly on a trainload of entirely unsuspecting local picnickers. They positioned themselves carefully beside the railway line ahead of time, raised their own homemade flag as an improvised symbolic gesture, and then simply waited patiently for the scheduled picnic train to pass directly by their position. As the crowded carriages rolled steadily past, packed full of entire families dressed in their best holiday clothing, the two men opened sustained gunfire directly into the crowd. The sudden, unexpected gunfire tore violently through what had been, only moments earlier, an entirely festive holiday scene, transforming a planned day of relaxed celebration into one of genuine terror and serious bloodshed within seconds. Several people were killed outright in the shocking, entirely unexpected assault, with a number of additional passengers left seriously wounded. The exposed passengers in the open carriages left almost completely defenseless with essentially nowhere at all to take cover or hide. The idea that a distant foreign war could somehow reach out and directly touch them here, of all remote places, on a day meant purely for simple celebration, would have seemed genuinely unthinkable to anyone just moments before it actually happened. The alarm was raised quickly across the local area, and armed police officers, along with available soldiers, rushed immediately to respond to the unfolding situation. The two gunmen did not manage to flee particularly far from the scene, and a direct armed confrontation followed shortly afterward, during which both attackers were ultimately killed by the responding authorities. The immediate physical threat itself was over almost as suddenly as it had first begun. But the deep collective shock of what had actually happened rippled outward far beyond the boundaries of the town itself. The simple realization that the distant war had managed to produce a genuine act of deadly violence in a place so impossibly remote from any actual battlefield left a deep, genuinely lasting impression on the wider public consciousness. A jarring, unwelcome reminder that no corner of the country, however isolated or seemingly insignificant, was truly entirely untouched by the vast, distant global conflict unfolding overseas. The overall incident holds a strange and genuinely singular place within the country's broader wartime history, standing as one of the very few documented occasions where the actual fighting of that global conflict spilled directly onto Australian domestic soil itself. And notably, it did so not through any invading foreign army or naval assault, but instead through the actions of just two individual men standing beside an ordinary railway line on an otherwise ordinary holiday morning. There were no significant grand strategic military stakes involved anywhere in the incident, and no meaningful military objective of any real lasting consequence. There was only ever a simple picnic train, a crudely improvised homemade flag, and a distant overseas war made suddenly, horribly, and violently local. It stands today as a small, genuinely sad, and thoroughly bizarre historical footnote attached to a much larger global war remembered by most people primarily for its distant overseas trenches. In a remote town sitting in the middle of nowhere, on a day intended entirely for simple joy, the wider world arrived instead without any warning at all, leaving the local community to grapple afterward with a form of violence that had, until that moment, seemed to belong entirely to another hemisphere altogether. Near the small country town of Gundagai stands a genuinely proud bronze statue depicting a dog calmly seated on top of an old-fashioned tucker box, which is simply traditional Australian bush slang for a wooden food storage chest. Tourists regularly stop by, take plenty of photographs, and generally admire the loyal-looking bronze hound with obvious affection. Here, though, is the underlying joke buried at the heart of the whole monument. The dog is actually immortalized in an old traditional bush poem, not for saving anyone's life or performing any particularly brave, heroic deed, but rather for essentially ruining an already exhausted bullock driver's already miserable day, in a manner considerably too crude and rude to describe delicately in polite company. Australia, as a country, looked seriously at a folk legend built entirely around an unhelpful, thoroughly badly behaved dog, and collectively decided that this particular dog fully deserved its own permanent bronze monument. And so, remarkably, it got one. The underlying story comes directly from the rugged, difficult world of the old colonial-era bullock drivers, the tough, weathered men who hauled enormously heavy wagons across the harsh colonial countryside using teams of straining, powerful oxen. It was, by every account, a genuinely hard, dirty, and largely thankless way to earn a living. Full of hopelessly bogged wagon wheels, constantly failing equipment, foul, unpredictable weather, and seemingly endless day-to-day frustration. The rich folk storytelling tradition surrounding these hardworking men naturally produced plenty of colorful ballads and tall tales recounting their various trials and tribulations. And one particular tale in this tradition took hold especially firmly in the popular imagination, and simply refused to ever let go, centered entirely around a single bullock driver having what can genuinely only be accurately described as an epically, catastrophically bad day from start to finish. In the traditional tale itself, Absolutely everything that can conceivably go wrong for the poor bullock driver does, in fact, go wrong over the course of a single miserable day. His heavily loaded wagon becomes hopelessly, completely stuck in the mud. His essential equipment fails him repeatedly at the worst possible moments. Tempers among the whole party fray badly under the mounting pressure. And the entire miserable ordeal steadily piles disaster directly on top of disaster, in the specific way that only a genuinely, comprehensively rotten day possibly can. And then, as the absolute final crowning insult to an already unbearable day, at the exact moment when the thoroughly exhausted driver might reasonably have hoped for at least one small remaining comfort, his own loyal dog delivers one last crushing indignity by thoroughly fouling his tucker box, completely ruining the very food supply he had been counting on to sustain him through the rest of his ordeal. The dog, in other words, does absolutely nothing whatsoever to rescue the deteriorating situation. The dog instead makes everything considerably worse, in the single most contemptible way imaginable under the circumstances. The more polite, sanitized versions of this particular legend, typically printed specifically for respectable general audiences, tend to soften the dog's actual crime down to something as entirely innocent as simply sitting quietly on top of the tucker box. The considerably earthier original version, passed informally around among the bullock drivers themselves for generations, made unmistakably, explicitly clear that the animal had actually done something considerably less charming to the contents of the food box in question. It is precisely this cruder, more explicit original version that gives the entire enduring story its characteristic cheeky bite and lasting popular appeal. A bit of genuinely rough traditional bush humor built entirely around one particularly bad day, capped off perfectly by one thoroughly disloyal dog. Why then, one might reasonably ask, would an entire local community choose to build a handsome, formal bronze monument specifically commemorating such an unhelpful animal? And yet that is precisely, exactly what actually happened. Near the town of Gundagai, a formal statue was eventually erected showing the dog perched serenely and proudly atop its tucker box, and it was officially unveiled with genuine public ceremony, quickly becoming a beloved and enduring local landmark in its own right. Travelers passing along the nearby highway gradually learned to routinely pull over for a proper look and an obligatory photograph, and the dog on the tucker box steadily settled comfortably into its ongoing role as one of the country's most cherished and most photographed roadside attractions. There is something genuinely, wonderfully characteristic of the national sense of humor buried within the whole enterprise. Rather than choosing to commemorate some heroic, faithful hound who bravely saved its exhausted master from disaster, the memorial instead deliberately celebrates a folk legend built directly around hardship, sheer bad luck, and one particularly disloyal dog behaving thoroughly disgracefully at the worst possible moment. The underlying humor of ordinary, everyday struggle, of absolutely everything going wrong at once, is honored formally and permanently in solid cast bronze. Generations of visitors have, by now, stood thoughtfully before the finished statue, many of them chuckling audibly once they finally learned the full, true story behind the outwardly placid-looking bronze dog. It endures today as a small, genuinely affectionate tribute to ordinary misfortune itself, and to a peculiar, distinctly national fondness for finding real comedy embedded within everyday disaster. Of all the many possible deeds a dog might conceivably be formally remembered for across history, this particular one is remembered essentially, entirely, for thoroughly ruining somebody's lunch. And the country, as a whole, evidently loved the story enough to permanently cast it in metal for future generations to enjoy. Drive far enough across almost any stretch of rural Australia, and sooner or later, without fail, you will come face to face with something genuinely enormous and entirely, deliberately unnecessary. A banana roughly the size of a full-grown bus, a merino sheep standing noticeably taller than an ordinary two-story house, a giant pineapple, a giant prawn, a giant koala, an enormous fiberglass merino ram you can actually walk directly inside of if you're so inclined. These scattered, oversized roadside constructions have come to be affectionately known nationwide simply as the big things. An entire loosely connected collection of deliberately oversized roadside monuments, built by small local towns over many decades specifically to lure curious passing travelers into pulling over and stopping for a while. There is genuinely no grand unifying master plan sitting behind any of it, and no single coordinated underlying theme running through the whole collection at all. Just a nationwide, decades-long, largely uncoordinated tradition of small country towns, quietly competing against one another to build the largest, strangest, most attention-grabbing version imaginable of some entirely ordinary, everyday object. The whole widespread phenomenon began, quite appropriately given everything that followed, with a single giant piece of oversized fruit. Somewhere along the eastern coastline, a local business decided, quite pragmatically, that the single best possible way to genuinely catch the eye of motorists speeding past on the highway was to simply erect an enormous fiberglass banana directly beside the road, a landmark so improbably large that it became genuinely impossible for passing drivers to ignore entirely. The underlying gamble worked spectacularly well, right from the very start. Curious, delighted travelers began pulling over regularly just to gawk properly at the sheer ridiculousness of the thing, and while they were stopped there anyway, naturally, they also tended to spend a fair amount of money at the attached local business. A simple, genuinely glorious commercial lesson had been thoroughly learned in the process. Nothing quite makes a weary long-distance traveler hit the brakes as reliably and as effectively as the sudden, unexpected sight of an ordinary piece of produce roughly the size of a full passenger vehicle. From that single original oversized banana, an entire genuine national obsession gradually bloomed and spread outward across the whole country. Individual towns scattered right across the continent, each one eager for their own respective slice of passing tourist trade, looked carefully at whatever their particular region happened to already be locally known for, and thought, quite reasonably, well, why not simply build an enormously oversized version of that exact thing? A region already well known nationally for its sheep farming duly raised up its own titanic merino, an absolutely hulking, woolly giant looming impressively over the passing highway traffic below. A coastal town proud of its local prawn fishing industry constructed its own immense fiberglass crustacean. Elsewhere across the country, in fairly rapid succession, sprang up a giant pineapple, a giant lobster, a giant guitar, a giant koala, and quite literally dozens upon dozens of further examples besides. Each individual town sincerely hopping its own particular oversized mascot might eventually earn it a permanent, well-deserved spot on the wider national tourist map. The genuine underlying beauty of the whole tradition lies specifically in its total, complete lack of any centralized coordination whatsoever. No central government authority or tourism board ever formally decreed, at any point, that the entire country ought to sprout enormous roadside objects at regular intervals. Each individual big thing was born instead purely out of genuine local civic pride, entirely local commercial ambition, and a slightly competitive, entirely informal local desire not to be visibly outdone by whatever the very next town along the highway happened to be building for itself. The resulting overall collection is gloriously random and thoroughly inconsistent, numbering many hundreds of individual examples strong nationwide, with absolutely no consistent underlying style, physical scale, or thematic subject matter connecting any of them together in any meaningful way. Some individual examples are genuinely lovingly crafted and impressively well executed from an engineering standpoint. Others are noticeably lumpy, visibly faded by years of harsh sun exposure, and rather charmingly amateurish in their overall construction, clearly assembled on an extremely tight local budget by well-meaning people who nonetheless believed, with their whole hearts, that their particular region genuinely deserved its own giant something standing proudly beside the highway. What could very easily have remained nothing more than a brief, passing commercial gimmick instead became, over subsequent decades, a genuinely cherished and deeply embedded part of the wider national culture. Families setting out on long cross-country road trips gradually began actively seeking these particular big things out along their route, methodically ticking each one off almost like an extended nationwide scavenger hunt spread out across an entire continent's worth of empty highway. Standing for an obligatory photograph directly beside the giant fruit, or posed underneath the towering fiberglass animal, gradually became something close to a genuine rite of passage for many families, a fun and memorable way of marking meaningful progress through the often vast, empty distances separating one small town from the next. The very same underlying silliness that might, in a different country, have doomed the whole tradition to quick failure instead became its single greatest lasting strength, and entire successive generations of children grew up carrying genuine, lasting affection for these thoroughly absurd, wonderfully sincere fiberglass and reinforced concrete giants scattered right across the landscape. There is something genuinely, deeply endearing about the whole enduring tradition when you step back and consider it properly. An entire country dotted generously with enormous, entirely pointless, thoroughly wonderful roadside landmarks, each individual one representing some small town's cheerful, largely unspoken bid for a little extra passing attention. In a country where the ordinary driving distances separating any two given towns can easily stretch on for hour after hour of largely unchanging scenery, the scattered big things stand collectively as genuine beacons of good-natured local humor along the way. They serve as small, standing monuments to the wonderfully simple underlying idea that if you build something sufficiently big and sufficiently daft, people passing by will, more often than not, actually stop and genuinely smile. And stop they reliably do, again and again, generation after generation, to stand there grinning happily beneath a fiberglass banana considerably taller than an ordinary house. In a country that decided, without ever quite formally deciding anything at all, that bigger genuinely is better, and that sillier, more often than not, tends to be best of all. Nearly every single Australian household kitchen, tucked away somewhere in the pantry, sits a small glass jar containing a thick, dark brown, almost entirely black savory paste, carrying a distinctive smell somewhere roughly between a working brewery and an intensely savory bouillon stock. To curious outsiders who bravely spread it thickly across their toast, mistakenly expecting something sweet along the lines of chocolate spread, the resulting first experience can prove genuinely quite upsetting. But Vegemite, made primarily from leftover brewer's yeast extract, is not merely casually tolerated across Australia. It is genuinely, actively loved, fiercely defended in conversation, and treated by most locals as a small but meaningful point of national pride. First invented in the early 1920s, this intensely salty, distinctively flavored spread became so deeply and thoroughly woven into everyday domestic life over subsequent decades that entire generations of Australian children grew up eating it, spread thinly across warm, buttered toast on a near-daily basis. The actual origins of this rather strange, distinctive substance turn out to be surprisingly humble and genuinely rather clever once properly explained. In the ordinary industrial process of brewing beer, breweries are consistently left with large residual quantities of used, spent yeast, a genuine byproduct of the brewing process with no particularly obvious commercial purpose of its own at the time. Some enterprising food scientists eventually realized that this leftover spent yeast, once properly processed and concentrated, could actually be transformed into a rich, deeply concentrated savory food paste, packed full of intense flavor along with a genuinely healthy dose of naturally occurring B vitamins. And so, quite remarkably, from the otherwise discarded dregs of the local brewing industry, an entirely new national food icon was effectively born, which is, by any reasonable measure, a considerably more romantic and interesting origin story than most ordinary household condiments can genuinely claim for themselves. When Vegemite first appeared commercially on grocery store shelves, it faced a genuinely considerable uphill marketing challenge. The underlying flavor profile is, to put it about as mildly as possible, a decidedly acquired taste, an intense, deeply salty, overwhelmingly savory flavor punch that bears essentially no meaningful resemblance whatsoever to the sweet spreads most people instinctively reach for at breakfast time. Successfully persuading the general public to willingly embrace a near-black paste manufactured directly from discarded brewery waste was genuinely no easy commercial task at all. And for a considerable stretch of time after its initial launch, the product struggled noticeably to find any real commercial footing against considerably more established, familiar rival spreads already sitting on the same grocery shelves. Clever, memorable marketing campaigns, genuinely catchy advertising jingles, and the product's demonstrably real underlying nutritional value gradually, steadily won over an increasingly skeptical general public over time. And once it finally did take hold commercially, it took hold thoroughly and completely, becoming firmly embedded within the daily domestic routines of the entire nation for generations to come. The single most critically important thing to properly understand about Vegemite, and the one common mistake that has genuinely ruined the very first taste experience for countless unsuspecting first-time visitors over the years, is simply the matter of correct quantity. This is emphatically not a spread meant to be applied generously or thickly, in the way one might naturally apply a sweeter breakfast spread. Slathered on thickly, as an unsuspecting newcomer might mistakenly attempt on their very first try, it delivers an overwhelming, genuinely mouth-puckering assault of concentrated salt that has reduced many a brave first-time taster to a visibly horrified grimace within seconds. The correct application method, understood essentially instinctively by every single local Australian from a young age, is instead to spread it in an extremely thin, whisper-light layer directly over toast that has already been properly buttered first, so that the underlying richness of the butter effectively tempers the spread's intense salty punch down into something considerably warmer, genuinely comforting, and thoroughly delicious in its own right. Get that particular ratio correctly balanced, and it quickly becomes genuinely clear exactly why so many people end up loving it so fiercely and so consistently throughout their entire lives. There is a deep, genuinely satisfying savory comfort to a properly prepared piece of Vegemite toast, a specific taste closely bound up, for most Australians, with cherished childhood mornings, packed school lunches, and the simple, comforting daily rhythms of home life. For many expatriate Australians living abroad, the distinctive flavor becomes considerably less a simple food item and more an entire emotional feeling in its own right, a genuinely edible shorthand for the abstract concept of belonging and home. This underlying emotional connection helps explain precisely why any casual suggestion that the spread might be somehow unpleasant or disgusting tends to provoke such immediate, genuinely spirited public defense from locals. To casually insult Vegemite is, in a small but very real sense, to indirectly insult the entire concept of breakfast itself. Its established status as a genuine national symbol runs sufficiently deep that Australian travelers heading overseas for extended periods have regularly been known to deliberately pack small jars of it carefully into their luggage, entirely unwilling to face a foreign country without at least some small taste of home safely tucked away with them. Homesick expatriates living abroad treasure it deeply, and the delighted, theatrical disgust of foreign friends being playfully talked into trying their very first spoonful has, over the decades, become something of a cherished cultural ritual in its own right among Australians living overseas. So this rather odd, dark, intensely salty paste, born originally from the otherwise discarded leftovers of ordinary commercial beer brewing, and utterly bewildering in its first taste to much of the wider world, sits proudly today in the kitchen pantry of an entire nation that genuinely adores it without any real reservation whatsoever. It looks, by any objective measure, thoroughly unpromising on first sight. It smells noticeably startling to the uninitiated, and it will genuinely overwhelm anyone foolish enough to use too much of it at once. And yet, spread correctly in a thin layer across properly buttered toast, it transforms into one of the single most beloved, most deeply comforting everyday tastes found anywhere across the entire sunburnt country. A small, dark jar of thoroughly genuine, homegrown national comfort. The most famous outlaw figure in the entirety of Australian colonial history absolutely refused, under any circumstances, to simply go down like some ordinary, unremarkable bushranger. When End Kelly and his small gang made their final, desperate stand in the small town of Glenrowan back in 1880, they did so while wearing crude suits of homemade armor that they had personally forged themselves out of stolen curved iron plow parts. Heavy metal plates covered their chests, backs, and heads entirely, transforming the small band of outlaws into strange, slow, clanking figures who lumbered forward directly through incoming police gunfire like something straight out of a genuine nightmare. The improvised armor successfully stopped incoming bullets aimed at the torso and head, but it critically left the wearer's legs almost entirely exposed and unprotected. And it was precisely there, in the end, that Kelly himself was finally brought down, fully armored and thoroughly defiant right up until the very last moment. Kelly was already, by that point, something close to a living legend even before the dramatic armor entered the story at all. A genuine bushranger whose overall personal story sat right along the blurry, contested lines separating hardened violent criminal from genuine folk hero in the eyes of the wider public. To the colonial authorities of the time, he was straightforwardly a horse thief, an armed robber, and a confirmed killer of police officers. To a great many ordinary rural settlers, however, particularly poorer rural families who felt genuinely bullied and mistreated by both the wealthy and by an often heavy-handed colonial police force, he instead represented a powerful symbol of defiance. A single man actively striking back against an entire system, many of them sincerely believed, was fundamentally rigged against people exactly like them. That fundamental divide in public opinion has genuinely never fully closed even today, and people continue to actively argue, more than a century later, over whether Kelly should properly be remembered as a villain or as a genuine folk hero. What genuinely sets his dramatic final chapter apart from virtually every other bushranger tale in Australian colonial history is the sheer audacious, almost theatrical strangeness of the homemade armor itself. In the direct lead-up to their planned final stand, the gang collected heavy curved iron mold boards, the thick, curved metal plates originally designed for use on ordinary farmers' plows, and set about painstakingly beating them by hand into genuinely wearable body protection at makeshift, improvised bush forges set up specifically for the purpose. The finished result was crude in its overall craftsmanship, enormously heavy to actually wear and move in, and genuinely menacing in its overall visual appearance. Each individual completed suit consisted of a solid breastplate, matching back and shoulder plates, and a cylindrical metal helmet fitted with only a narrow horizontal slit to see through. The entire assembled outfit weighed enough, combined, to noticeably and seriously slow down any ordinary man's movement. Visually, it looked considerably less like something belonging to the modern era of railways and telegraph lines, and considerably more like a medieval knight who had somehow wandered several centuries off course and ended up in the Australian bush by mistake. The dramatic final showdown itself came at the small town of Glenrowan, where the gang had taken temporary control of a local hotel and quickly found themselves fully surrounded by a large contingent of police. In the smoky, chaotic confusion of the resulting siege, Kelly himself eventually emerged directly into the pale early morning light, fully clad in his improvised iron suit, and the immediate effect on the surrounding police officers was, by multiple surviving accounts, one of genuine, complete disbelief. They fired directly at him repeatedly, and the incoming bullets simply struck the metal plating and glanced harmlessly away, the crude armor successfully absorbing hit after hit that would easily have killed any ordinary, unprotected man instantly. To the assembled police at the scene, it must genuinely have seemed, in that surreal moment, as though the outlaw had somehow become something entirely inhuman. A slow, lumbering iron apparition steadily advancing directly through active gunfire, apparently completely unkillable by conventional means. But the hastily improvised armor carried one genuinely fatal design flaw, and in hindsight, it was an entirely obvious one. In their understandable focus on properly protecting the head and torso from incoming fire, the gang had left both the arms and, crucially, the legs completely bare and entirely unprotected. Kelly could successfully shrug off direct hits to his heavily armored body without apparent effect, but his exposed legs remained genuinely vulnerable throughout. And eventually, the surrounding police officers correctly worked out exactly where to properly aim their fire. A sustained, deliberate volley of shots directed specifically at his legs finally brought the previously towering, seemingly invincible armored figure crashing heavily to the ground, and the supposedly unstoppable Iron Man was, within moments, suddenly reduced to nothing more than an ordinary wounded outlaw, sprawled helplessly on the ground, finally genuinely vulnerable to capture. Kelly survived the immediate siege itself, only to subsequently face a formal criminal trial, and he was ultimately convicted and executed not particularly long afterward, going to his eventual death with essentially the same stubborn defiance he had displayed consistently throughout his entire criminal career. His widely reported final words before execution have since become one of the single most frequently quoted phrases in the entire national historical memory. A weary, almost resigned shrug directed at the whole absurd, ultimately tragic arc of his short life. The physical armor itself survived him and endured afterward, carefully preserved and put on public display, and it remains today one of the single most genuinely striking physical artifacts found anywhere in the country's colonial-era historical record. It is, by any objective measure, a genuinely bizarre physical object to encounter in person, this heavy, crude suit of improvised bulletproof iron. Hand-hammered directly out of ordinary stolen farm equipment by a small gang of desperate outlaws hiding out in the Australian bush. Of all the many possible ways a man might choose, consciously or not, to be permanently remembered by history, Kelly ended up remembered specifically as the man who fought his very last battle dressed, quite literally, like a homemade medieval knight. Not content with having already imported rabbits and single-handedly triggering one full-blown ecological catastrophe, a number of homesick colonial settlers back in the 1800s decided that the country was also sorely missing something else genuinely dear to their hearts from back home: the traditional thrill of the organized fox hunt. So, quite deliberately this time, foxes were imported directly and released into the countryside, purely so that wealthy local gentlemen could enjoy chasing them properly across open farmland on horseback, exactly as they remembered doing back in Britain. Predictably, given everything that had already happened with the rabbits, the foxes had entirely different plans of their own. Rather than politely providing the intended sport, they instead spread rapidly across the entire continent and began devastating the local native wildlife in earnest, becoming yet another genuinely devastating introduced predator in a country that, by this particular point in its history, really ought to have already learned considerably better than to keep importing new animals on a whim. The underlying motivation, much like with the earlier rabbits, was pure sentimental nostalgia dressed up carefully as a respectable form of outdoor recreation. Wealthy colonists who had personally grown up in Britain genuinely missed the grand traditional spectacle of the organized hunt. That whole theatrical display of riders dressed in formal red coats, packs of baying hunting hounds working together, and a fleeing fox racing desperately across open fields ahead of the pursuing party. It was, in truth, as much about visible social status and formal ceremony as it was ever really about the fox itself as an animal. To properly recreate this cherished traditional pastime in their unfamiliar new home, the colonists needed the genuine star performer of the whole show. And so, red foxes were duly shipped out from Britain and formally released into the open countryside, specifically to be pursued afterward purely for organized entertainment purposes. By that particular point in the colony's short history, it really should have been entirely obvious where this particular decision was inevitably heading. The rabbits had already demonstrated, with genuinely brutal clarity, exactly what tends to happen when a European animal with no natural predators is deliberately released into a landscape that has never previously encountered anything remotely like it. The Australian environment, with its many unique native species that had evolved in complete isolation for millions of uninterrupted years, proved almost entirely defenseless against clever, highly adaptable European newcomers of this kind. But the underlying lesson had apparently not genuinely sunk in among the colonial gentry, and the foxes were released regardless, presumably with pleasant visions of splendid future hunts already dancing in their owners' heads. The foxes themselves, being foxes, took one quick look around at their brand new home and immediately recognized it for exactly what it genuinely was: an all-you-can-eat buffet with essentially no meaningful competition whatsoever, and an abundant population of naturally naive prey animals that had absolutely no evolved instinct for how to properly deal with a predator quite like this. Australia's native mammals and ground-dwelling birds, many of them small in size, and having evolved for millions of years in a landscape entirely without such a predator, made remarkably easy, defenseless targets. The foxes hunted them relentlessly and systematically, and their own numbers grew steadily as they spread outward across the continent, following essentially the exact same devastating expansion pattern the rabbits had already established before them. The resulting long-term consequences have proven genuinely catastrophic and remarkably long-lasting. Foxes are today widely considered to be one of the single most ecologically damaging introduced predators found anywhere across the entire continent, directly implicated in the sharp population decline, and in a number of documented cases, the complete extinction of numerous distinct native Australian species. Small native marsupials, ground-nesting birds, and various other especially vulnerable creatures have been hit particularly hard by their arrival, hunted relentlessly across a landscape that offered them essentially no meaningful evolutionary defense whatsoever against this new kind of threat. And in a grimly perfect ecological irony, the foxes and the rabbits, both originally imported purely for the personal amusement of homesick settlers, ended up locked together in a genuinely strange, mutually reinforcing partnership of ongoing ecological destruction. The rabbits provided a conveniently abundant, ready food source that directly helped the growing fox population thrive and expand even further, while the two species working together tore steadily through the surrounding native environment in a genuine double act of sustained ecological ruin. The organized hunts themselves, one can reasonably imagine, were genuinely splendid entertainment for a while, at least for those wealthy enough to participate directly. But the true lasting legacy of that particular nostalgic personal whim turned out to be considerably more than just a pleasant series of enjoyable afternoons spent on horseback. It became instead a permanent, continent-wide ecological disaster that dedicated conservationists continue actively battling against even today, spending genuinely enormous ongoing effort and resources simply trying to protect whatever remains of the country's unique native wildlife from a predator that was, in the end, deliberately invited in purely so that a handful of people could enjoy an entertaining afternoon chase. It stands today as perhaps one of the single clearest available examples of a lesson the colony seemed genuinely determined, again and again, not to properly learn. Bring an unfamiliar animal across the entire world purely for personal entertainment, and eventually the entertainment itself inevitably ends. The animal, unfortunately, tends to stay behind forever. On the gold fields surrounding Ballarat back in 1854, the ordinary working diggers had finally, genuinely had enough. They were being charged remarkably expensive mining licenses simply for the basic right to search for gold at all, and were being harassed relentlessly and repeatedly by heavy-handed colonial police who routinely demanded to see those same licenses checked at every possible turn, regardless of the circumstances. Genuinely furious at this treatment, the assembled miners eventually banded together in open protest, ceremonially burned their hated licenses, hastily constructed a rough wooden defensive stockade, and proudly raised their own improvised flag of open rebellion directly beneath the stars of the Southern Cross. The colonial authorities responded with immediate, overwhelming military force, storming the hastily built stockade in a brief but genuinely bloody dawn assault. Though the resulting uprising itself was thoroughly crushed within a matter of mere minutes, it went on to become an enduring, powerful symbol within the broader historical story of Australian democracy. The original gold rush had drawn tens of thousands of genuinely hopeful diggers from all corners of the world to these particular fields, every one of them chasing the same shared dream of striking it, rich through sheer hard physical labor and a healthy dose of pure luck. But the underlying day-to-day reality proved consistently harsh. Actually finding meaningful quantities of gold was genuinely difficult, thoroughly backbreaking work, and mostly entirely unrewarding for the vast majority of ordinary diggers involved. And on top of these already punishing daily working conditions sat a deeply resented additional colonial tax. Every single miner was legally required to purchase an official license simply to dig, an expensive document demanded of them entirely regardless of whether they ever actually found so much as a single flake of gold in return. For men already laboring exhaustingly in the mud for consistently little tangible reward, this particular licensing fee understandably felt like a genuinely cruel and pointless additional injustice. Considerably worse than the underlying fee itself was the deeply resented manner in which it was actively enforced across the goldfields. The colonial authorities regularly conducted frequent, aggressive license hunts, with armed police officers storming directly through the working diggings and demanding that ordinary miners produce their official papers on the spot immediately, without warning. Those unfortunate enough to be unable to comply, perhaps simply because they had accidentally left their license paperwork back in their tent that particular day, were treated outright as criminals, formally fined on the spot, and in some documented cases even physically chained up as punishment. The entire licensing system was widely regarded by the ordinary working diggers as fundamentally corrupt and deeply oppressive, functioning essentially as a convenient means of squeezing both money and control out of already hardworking ordinary men. An accumulated resentment among the diggers steadily built toward an eventual genuine boiling point over subsequent months. Matters finally came to a definitive head following a series of accumulated grievances and one particular controversial death that the assembled miners genuinely felt had gone entirely unpunished by the colonial authorities. Their collective anger quickly crystallized into organized, coordinated protest. In one dramatic, highly public act of open defiance, the assembled diggers gathered together and formally burned their hated licenses in great celebratory bonfires, openly refusing to pay the hated fee any longer. Their elected leaders then formally swore a solemn oath of mutual solidarity beneath a newly created flag, proudly bearing the stars of the Southern Cross, and the group quickly threw up a rough timber defensive stockade at the Eureka site as a genuine fortified stand directly against the colonial authorities. The colonial government's official response was swift, decisive, and thoroughly overwhelming in scale. In the pale early light of one particular morning, at a moment when many of the miners inside the hastily built stockade had either already drifted away or were caught entirely off guard by the timing, colonial soldiers and police together launched a sudden, coordinated assault on the position. The resulting fighting was genuinely fierce but brutally, mercifully short, over within a matter of minutes at most. The defenders, badly outnumbered and thoroughly outgunned by comparison, were quickly overrun, and a number of miners were killed in the fighting, along with several members of the attacking colonial force. The rebellion itself, considered strictly as an organized armed uprising, was comprehensively and decisively defeated well before the sun had even properly finished rising that morning. And yet, in losing that particular military battle so completely, the Diggers arguably went on to win the far larger, longer-term political war that followed. The subsequent public reaction to the resulting bloodshed proved to be one of genuinely widespread public sympathy for the ordinary miners rather than for the colonial authorities involved. When the surviving rebels were eventually formally put on trial for their role in the uprising, local juries consistently refused to convict them of any serious crime, and the colonial government itself, genuinely stung by the resulting public backlash, moved fairly quickly afterward to properly address the very underlying grievances that had originally sparked the entire revolt in the first place. The deeply hated mining license system was formally abolished. Considerably fairer administrative arrangements were introduced in its place, and the ordinary miners themselves gained a genuine, meaningful political voice going forward, including, significantly, the formal right to vote in colonial elections. So a short, ultimately doomed military stand made behind a fairly flimsy wooden barricade grew, over subsequent decades, into something considerably larger and more historically significant than itself, remembered today as a genuine foundational moment within the country's broader democratic story. The stockade itself fell within a matter of minutes, but the flag it proudly raised that morning, and the underlying democratic ideals behind it, proved considerably harder for anyone to permanently knock back down. In 1998, a pilot flying low over a genuinely remote stretch of the South Australian outback happened to spot something on the ground below that simply should not have been there at all. Carefully etched directly into the barren desert earth was the unmistakable outline of a hunting man, spear held ready in hand, so genuinely enormous in scale that it stretched for more than 4 kilometers from head to toe, making it, by most reasonable measures, one of the single largest deliberate artworks ever created anywhere by human hands. The genuinely astonishing part of the whole story is that nobody, to this day, actually knows for certain who made it. No construction machinery was ever reported seen in the area. No official permits of any kind were ever filed with local authorities. No individual artist has ever formally, publicly stepped forward to claim personal credit for the enormous completed work. To this very day, the true identity of whoever originally carved the so-called Merry Man into the remote desert floor remains a genuine, entirely unsolved historical mystery. The sheer physical scale of the completed figure is genuinely difficult to properly grasp from ground level alone. This was never a figure that could reasonably be taken in with a single casual glance from the ground. It was so enormous in scale that its full, complete outline could only truly be properly appreciated from high up in the air. Its carefully carved lines traced deliberately across the otherwise flat, empty desert plain in deep grooves, cut directly into the surface of the earth itself. The completed figure depicted a traditional Aboriginal hunter, a lean human form apparently poised mid-motion with a traditional throwing stick, or spear held ready, rendered throughout, with a deceptive simplicity that only made its genuinely impossible overall size feel considerably more striking and unsettling by comparison. It ranks today among the single largest geoglyphs found anywhere across the entire world, sitting comfortably in the same broad category as the ancient desert markings elsewhere that have similarly puzzled researchers and historians for many centuries. The key underlying difference, of course, is that those other famous ancient geoglyphs found elsewhere around the world are typically many thousands of years old, with their original creators long since lost entirely to the passage of time. This particular figure, by striking contrast, had apparently appeared essentially overnight in the fully modern era, in a country thoroughly equipped with aircraft, orbital satellites, and professional land surveyors. And still, remarkably, nobody had ever actually witnessed it being made. Somewhere out across that vast, genuinely lonely stretch of open desert, somebody had etched an entire human figure into the ground on a scale that would have required serious advanced planning, precise mathematical measurement, and almost certainly some form of heavy earth-moving equipment, and had somehow managed to do so entirely without being noticed at any point, without leaving behind any obvious equipment trail, and without ever once coming forward publicly afterward to claim proper credit. The surrounding mystery only deepened further with a strange trickle of cryptic clues that subsequently surfaced in connection with the discovery. Cryptic anonymous messages and oblique references connected loosely to the figure surfaced periodically in various odd, unexpected ways over the following years, hinting tantalizingly at who might possibly be responsible, yet consistently leading absolutely nowhere conclusive in the end. Numerous competing theories multiplied over time. Some observers suspected an eccentric individual artist deliberately making some kind of audacious personal artistic statement. Others speculated openly about obscure hidden motives, deeper symbolic meanings, or elaborate, carefully planned hoaxes. Every promising lead that emerged seemed to eventually dissolve back into further unanswered questions, and no single proposed explanation has ever fully satisfied everyone involved, nor produced any genuinely confessed creator willing to step forward. What makes the entire strange affair so genuinely compelling, in the end, is precisely how thoroughly unlikely the whole thing actually is when you stop to properly consider it. In a modern era when it genuinely feels as though nothing particularly large can realistically happen entirely unseen anywhere on the planet, when virtually the entire land surface has already been carefully mapped, regularly photographed from orbit, and continuously monitored by satellite, somebody nonetheless managed to successfully create one of the single largest human figures found anywhere on the planet in complete, total secrecy. It is genuinely the sort of achievement that ought to be essentially impossible to successfully pull off anonymously in the modern world. And yet there it still sits today, enormous and entirely unclaimed, a colossal, permanent question mark scratched deliberately into the otherwise empty outback. Over the intervening years, the figure itself gradually began to fade noticeably, its once crisp outline slowly softening as ordinary desert wind and weather steadily worked away at the exposed earth, threatening eventually to erase the whole thing entirely from view. At one particular point, dedicated efforts were made by local volunteers to properly freshen up the fading outline and actively preserve it, ensuring that the surrounding mystery would not simply be allowed to quietly vanish back into the dust from which it had so strangely and suddenly first emerged. Even that later act of careful preservation, however, did absolutely nothing whatsoever to answer the central, enduring riddle of exactly who had originally made it, or precisely why. And so the giant figure of the hunter remains today, striding silently forward across the empty desert, visible mainly only to those who happen to fly directly overhead, standing as a permanent monument to some entirely unknown hand. It endures today as one of the genuinely strangest unsolved riddles found anywhere in the country's relatively recent history, an artwork of quite staggering physical size and evident effort, whose original creator chose, for reasons nobody has ever successfully learned, to remain entirely and permanently invisible. Crossing the vast, flat, treeless expanse of the Nullarbor Plain runs a stretch of railway line so relentlessly, unbrokenly straight that it holds an official world record for the longest straight run of track anywhere on Earth. For nearly 500 kilometers, the rails run without a single curve, bend, or deviation of any kind, one unbroken steel line pointing directly at the horizon. Drivers guiding trains along this stretch can travel for hours while barely needing to touch the steering controls at all, watching an almost completely unchanging landscape crawl steadily past the windows. The Nullarbor itself takes its very name from Latin words meaning no trees, and gazing out across that endless, empty plain, split perfectly in two by an arrow-straight rail line, feels considerably less like ordinary geography and considerably more like staring at a computer screensaver. To properly appreciate how this particular record came to exist, you have to understand the landscape it crosses. The Nullarbor Plain is one of the largest single continuous stretches of exposed limestone found anywhere on the entire planet. A colossal, almost perfectly flat expanse stretching across the southern portion of the continent. There are no hills to climb, no valleys to navigate around, no rivers requiring bridges, and true to its name, virtually no trees of any kind to speak of. It is a place of genuinely overwhelming emptiness, a horizon so featureless that land and sky seem to blur together in the shimmering heat. When engineers set about laying a railway across this plain to connect the country's far-flung population centers, they were handed a genuinely rare engineering gift. On most terrain anywhere in the world, a railway must bend and weave constantly to follow the natural contours of the land. Here, there was simply nothing to bend around at all. The builders could lay the track in a dead straight line and simply keep going and going for an almost absurd distance before anything at all required a change of course. The result is a section of railway that runs perfectly straight for a distance that genuinely stretches the imagination. For the entire length of it, the rails never deviate, not even by a gentle curve. A train setting out along this stretch points itself directly at the horizon and holds that exact line for hours on end, the same flat scrubland rolling past on either side without meaningful change. For passengers aboard, the experience is a peculiar mix of genuine engineering awe and hypnotic monotony. There is real wonder in knowing you're crossing one of the great straight lines of human engineering, but there is also something profoundly meditative about the sameness of it. No town appears. No landmark breaks the horizon. The mind drifts, the hours stretch on, and the plain simply continues, indifferent and immense. In 1860, an expensive, generously funded expedition set out to cross the Australian continent from south to north, led by two men named Burke and Wills. Through a cascading series of poor decisions, sheer bad luck, and staggeringly unfortunate timing, the entire venture slowly unraveled. In the cruelest possible twist, the two exhausted lead explorers finally staggered back to their supply base at Cooper Creek, only to discover that their support party, after waiting there for months on end, had given up hope and departed that very same day, mere hours before their arrival. Left with only meager rations buried beneath a single marked tree, the men slowly starved in a land where genuine rescue had so narrowly, agonizingly slipped away. The expedition had begun amid enormous public fanfare, its wealthy backers sparing little expense in assembling a large, well-supplied party, complete with a string of camels specially imported for the harsh interior conditions. Almost from the very start, however, things began going wrong. Impatient leadership pushed a small advance group ahead at a punishing pace, splitting off entirely from the main party and leaving a support crew behind at the Cooper Creek depot with clear instructions to simply wait. The advance group struggled onward through brutal conditions and came agonizingly close to reaching the northern coast, but the effort left them shattered and half-starved on the long return journey. Back at the depot, the waiting support party held on far longer than originally instructed, but eventually, reasonably concluding the advance group must have perished, they packed up and departed for home, setting the stage for one of history's most agonizing near misses, as the returning explorers stumbled into the abandoned camp mere hours too late, dying slowly of starvation in the very heart of the continent they had set out to conquer. For a remarkable stretch of its economic history, Australia's entire national prosperity balanced quite literally on the woolly shoulders of sheep. Wool proved so profitable and so central to the colony's wealth that the whole nation came to be commonly described as riding on the sheep's back. Vast flocks spread steadily across the open grasslands. Wool became the country's single great export commodity, and the fortunes of entire towns rose and fell directly with the international price of fleece. Discovered to be extraordinarily well suited to raising a particular fine-wooled breed, the wide, dry interior grasslands turned this young colony into one of the world's great wool suppliers, feeding the hungry textile mills of the industrial age with a steady stream of high-quality fleece. Great pastoral estates spread across the countryside, and the men who owned the largest flocks became genuinely wealthy and powerful. When wool prices were high, prosperity flowed freely through the entire economy. When they fell, the pain was felt everywhere, a stark reminder of just how completely national fortune depended on the backs of these placid, endlessly grazing animals. Out on the lonely, remote plains of western Queensland, travelers crossing the country after dark have told the same eerie story for well over a century. A strange glowing light appears somewhere out in the darkness, hovering at a distance, and then begins, unmistakably, to follow. It keeps pace no matter how quickly you move, hanging there in the black nothingness, sometimes for miles, before vanishing abruptly without any explanation at all. These are the Min lights, and they have genuinely unsettled stockmen, drivers, and locals for generations. Scientists have proposed theories involving atmospheric light refraction, bending unusually across the perfectly flat terrain, distant light sources carried and distorted over great distances through layers of air at different temperatures. Out there alone in the true darkness of the outback, however, no tidy scientific explanation ever feels quite convincing enough to fully dispel the unease. For more than 30 years, a single word kept mysteriously appearing across the pavements of Sydney, written again and again in beautiful, flowing copperplate chalk handwriting. Eternity. Nobody knew who was writing it. The elegant script would appear overnight on footpaths and street corners, then simply show up again somewhere entirely new. Eventually, the anonymous writer was revealed to be a reformed former soldier named Arthur Stace, a man who, deeply moved by a single sermon urging listeners to contemplate eternity, took it upon himself to quietly chalk that one hopeful word across his city many hundreds of thousands of times over the following decades. A humble, devoted mission carried out in the pre-dawn stillness that became one of Sydney's most beloved and enduring urban legends. His single word, eventually displayed proudly in grand public celebrations long after his own passing. Finally tonight, to the thylacine, better known as the Tasmanian tiger, a striped, dog-shaped marsupial predator unlike anything else alive on Earth, a creature that carried its young in a pouch yet hunted very much like a wolf. For a long time it prowled the wild forests of Tasmania, until relentless hunting, bounty programs, and habitat loss drove it steadily toward the very edge of extinction. The last known thylacine died alone in a Hobart Zoo enclosure in 1936. What makes this particular loss so genuinely haunting is that it did not happen in some misty, distant past. We possess actual grainy black and white film footage of that very last animal, packing quietly in its enclosure, proof of a magnificent, evolutionarily unique animal that we watched, quite literally on camera, slip away forever within living memory. And so, as the night settles softly around us, and this strange, sunburnt corner of the world grows quiet, we come gently to the end of tonight's wandering. What a genuinely peculiar journey it has been. We have visited a land that once lost an actual war to a flock of birds and never quite lived it down. We have met an animal so odd that respected scientists once took scissors to it, certain it had to be an elaborate trick. We have seen toads imported to save a harvest and rabbits released for a spot of weekend sport, each one quietly blossoming into a slow, absurd catastrophe all its own. We have stood beside a lake the color of bubblegum, wandered through a town that lives entirely underground, and gazed up at a banana the size of a bus. It is easy to laugh at all of it, and we certainly have. But underneath the strangeness lies something quietly admirable. This is a place shaped by stubborn, resourceful, endlessly inventive people, folk who carved their homes into the cool earth to escape an unbearable heat, who built an entire new capital city just to settle a petty argument, who found real comedy in a catastrophically bad day and cast it lovingly in bronze. They endured a harsh, baffling, unpredictable land, and they did it time and again with a shrug and a grin. So tonight, as you sink into your own soft bed, warm and safe, and far from exploding gum trees and mysterious following lights, perhaps smile a little at how gloriously odd the world can truly be. History is not always grand and solemn. Sometimes it is a horse an entire broken nation adored, a single word written in chalk many hundreds of thousands of times, a truth far stranger than any invented lie. Let those thoughts settle gently now. Let your breathing slow, and drift quietly, peacefully into sleep.